The wealthiest man in Wyoming, owner of thousands of acres, a powerful cattle empire, and a house too large for one man to fill, stood on a train platform in the dead of winter, waiting for a woman he had never met. And that woman, before the train ever arrived, had sent him a single letter that said, "I am not beautiful. If you wish to withdraw your offer, I will understand." Colton Hayes read those words 3 times. Then he folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, and stayed on that platform. This is the story of what happened next, and why it changed both of them forever. If this story moves you, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and follow the channel so you never miss what comes next. The telegram from the matrimonial agency arrived on a Tuesday in late October, which was, by any reasonable measure, the worst possible time for Colton Hayes to be thinking about a wife. He had 300 head of cattle down with a respiratory infection spreading through the north pasture, a fence line along the creek that had buckled under 2 weeks of hard rain, and a foreman, his best one, a taciturn man named Silas Drum, who had just announced he was leaving for his brother's spread in Montana before the first snowfall. The Hayes Ranch was the kind of operation that demanded everything a man had, and lately it had been taking more than that. But the telegram sat on the kitchen table where Colton had dropped it 3 days ago, and every morning when he came in from the early chores and poured himself a cup of coffee, his eyes found it the way a tongue finds a broken tooth. He didn't throw it away. That told him something about himself that he wasn't entirely comfortable with. He was 41 years old. He owned 11,000 acres in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming, a house with 7 rooms that he mostly didn't use, 212 cattle that survived the infection and 2 that didn't, and a reputation across 4 counties as a man who was good for his word and difficult to know. He had been a widower for 6 years. He had not been looking for a wife. The agency had contacted him, which he found strange and a little embarrassing, through a mutual acquaintance, a rancher named Foster Briggs, who had himself married through correspondence 2 years prior and seemed to feel a personal obligation to evangelize on the subject. Colton had listened to Foster's pitch over a fence post in August, nodded in what he hoped was a non-committal way, and said he'd think about it. He'd meant it as a polite way of ending the conversation. He hadn't expected the agency to take his non-committal nod as an application. He read the telegram again on Thursday morning. Miss Clara Whitlock of Cedar Falls, Iowa, has reviewed your profile and accepted correspondence. She is 34 years of age, unmarried, experienced in domestic management and cooking. Agency recommends exchange of letters before any formal arrangement. Reply at your earliest convenience. Colton set the telegram down and looked out the kitchen window at the gray sky pressing low over the barn roof. He thought about the 7 rooms. He thought about the way the house was quiet in a way that ordinary quiet wasn't. A specific silence that had weight and texture, like something that had moved in after Margaret died and hadn't been asked to leave. He wrote back to the agency that afternoon. He said he was willing to correspond. Tretz. Clara Whitlock's first letter arrived 3 weeks later, on a morning when the first real snow of the season had dusted the ground overnight, and the ranch hands were moving with that particular hunched urgency that cold brought out in working men. Colton read it at the kitchen table while his coffee went cold. She wrote plainly. That was the first thing he noticed. No performative sweetness, no studied attempt to charm. She described Cedar Falls the way you'd describe a place to someone who needed directions rather than poetry. She said she had kept house for her widowed father for 11 years, and that he had died in the spring, which was why she was writing to a matrimonial agency at 34 rather than 24. She said she could cook, manage household accounts, handle a kitchen garden, and put up preserves. She said she was not a particularly skilled seamstress, but she was improving. She did not say she was lonely, but Colton read between those careful, practical lines and found something that felt like honesty. He wrote back. He told her about the ranch without inflating it, gave her the numbers, the acreage, the operation, the weather. He told her about Margaret in 2 sentences, which was about as much as he could manage. He mentioned that the house was large and that he had not been good at filling it. They wrote for 2 months. Her letters came every 10 days or so, always the same measured, careful prose, always something real in them. A memory of her father, a complaint about the cost of flour, a story about a neighbor's dog that had eaten through her garden fence 3 times, and the neighbor's bafflement each time, as though the dog were acting alone and without motive. Colton found himself reading those letters more than once. He found himself writing back with more than he intended to. In December, he asked if she would consider coming to Wyoming. She wrote back quickly, faster than usual. Mr. Hayes, before you extend a formal offer, there is something I should tell you. I am not a beautiful woman. I say this not to invite reassurance, but because I believe you should know what you're agreeing to before the agreement is made. There have been situations in my past where my appearance became a source of embarrassment for the man I was with, and I would not want to arrive only to find that the woman you imagined from these letters is different from the woman who steps off the train. If this changes your thinking, I understand completely, and I thank you for the correspondence. Colton read that letter on a Sunday evening, sitting by the stove with his boots off. He read it twice. Then he sat with it for a long time, watching the fire through the iron grate. He thought about what it took to write a letter like that. The particular courage of putting your own worst fear down in ink and sending it to someone who could confirm it. He wrote back the same night, Miss Whitlock, I have seen plenty of beautiful women in my life, and I have been married to one, and I can tell you honestly that beauty is among the least reliable things a person can bring into a household. What I have found in your letters is something I have found in very few people of any appearance, which is that you say what you mean, and you mean what you say. If you are willing to come to Wyoming, I am willing to begin building something with you, whatever that turns out to be. The offer stands. She arrived on a Friday afternoon in late January. The Harwick station was a modest affair. A low wooden building, 2 benches outside that nobody used in winter, a platform that collected wind from the open plain with institutional efficiency. Colton stood on that platform in his good coat, which he had brushed that morning for the first time in over a year, and he watched the train come in from the south. He was not good at waiting. He had never been good at it. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and tried not to shift his weight too obviously. The train exhaled steam and slowed, and the doors opened, and passengers stepped out in the usual scattered way. A family with too much luggage, 2 men who looked like they were arguing about something they'd started arguing about 3 stops back. A woman in a yellow coat who was clearly not Clara Whitlock, because she walked directly to a man waiting at the far end of the platform and kissed him on the cheek. And then there was a woman standing at the top of the steps with a single large trunk being handed down behind her, looking at the platform with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite resignation, but something in between. She was not beautiful. That part had been accurate. She was of medium height and on the plain side of ordinary. A wide, honest face. Brown hair wound back without much artifice. A coat that had been mended at one elbow. She stood with the particular stillness of someone who was used to being assessed and had learned to wait through it. Colton walked toward her. She saw him coming, and he watched something happen in her expression. A small tightening, a bracing, like a person who expects the next thing to be unpleasant. It was a reflex. He recognized it the way you recognize something that has been trained into a person over years. Miss Whitlock, he said. Mr. Hayes. Her voice was steadier than he expected. Thank you for meeting me. It's a long trip, he said. You must be tired. A little. They stood for a half-second longer than was comfortable. Colton could feel the weight of the assessment she was waiting for, the moment where his face would confirm whatever she feared. He decided not to give her that moment. The wagon's around the front, he said. We've got about an hour's drive to the ranch. I had Rosa. She's the cook. She's been with the ranch since before I took it over. I had her make soup. Clara blinked. Yes, that would be welcome. He picked up her trunk himself before she could protest. She followed him around to the front of the station where the wagon was tied, and he helped her up to the seat, and they drove north through a landscape that was gray and white and very large. She looked at it without speaking for a while. It's bigger than I expected, she said finally. It gets bigger, he said. You get used to the size eventually, but it takes a while. Does it make you feel small? He considered that. Sometimes. Mostly it makes other things feel less important. She turned and looked at him, and he could see she was deciding something about him based on that answer. He didn't know what she decided. They drove the rest of the way with occasional conversation. She asked about the cattle operation, and he explained it without dumbing it down, and she asked follow-up questions that told him she had been paying attention in his letters. When the ranch came into view, the main house, the bunkhouse, the barn, and outbuildings arranged in the pragmatic geometry of a working spread. He heard her breath change slightly. "That's a large house," she said. "Too large," he said. "I don't use half of it." "What do you use?" "Kitchen, my bedroom, the office. The rest is just space." She looked at it. "Space can be fixed," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that he couldn't quite read. Rosa Alvarez had been cooking for the Hayes Ranch for 19 years, and she was a woman who formed opinions about people quickly and held them stubbornly. She had watched 3 of Colton's hired hands come and go, had outlasted 2 particularly difficult winters, and had opinions about nearly everything that she shared without being asked. She met Clara at the kitchen door with a look that was frankly evaluative and made no pretense otherwise. Clara met the look without flinching. "You want to eat first or see your room first?" Rosa asked. "Eat," Clara said, without hesitation. Rosa's expression shifted slightly. Not a smile, but a loosening. "Good answer," she said, and stepped back to let her in. Colton watched this from across the kitchen and found that something in his chest had gone slightly less tense. The soup was a thick beef stew, and Clara ate it like someone who hadn't had a proper meal since Cedar Falls, which, she admitted, was accurate. She'd been too nervous to eat much on the train. Rosa watched her eat with an expression of quiet approval that she probably didn't realize she was wearing. Colton ate his own bowl and kept the conversation light. Who worked the ranch, what the winter operation looked like, where things were. After dinner, he showed her to the room he'd had Rosa air out and make up, the largest of the spare bedrooms, which had a window facing east and got the morning light. It had been Margaret's sewing room, a fact he mentioned, and then immediately wondered if he shouldn't have. Clara looked at him. "I don't mind that," she said simply. "Rooms get new purposes." He left her to settle in. Standing in the hallway afterward, he noticed that the house felt different. Not fixed. Nothing was fixed, but slightly different. The weight of the silence had shifted by some small, unmeasurable amount. Clara woke in the dark at 4:30 out of habit and lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the sounds of a ranch that didn't sleep entirely. Cattle moving somewhere far off, the creak of a cold building contracting, wind over the roof. She had not slept well. That was also habit. She'd spent the train ride from Cedar Falls rehearsing what his face would do when he saw her. She'd been through that moment before, not with a rancher, not with anyone as controlled as Colton Hayes, but she'd been through the version of it where a man's expression did a small, involuntary thing that told her the truth before his mouth could compose something polite. She had been standing on that platform waiting for that expression with the resignation of a woman who had learned to take her disappointments quickly, like medicine. It hadn't come. She didn't know what to do with that. She got up at 5 and dressed quietly and found the kitchen without waking anyone, and she built the fire in the stove the way she'd built fires all her life, and she put on coffee, and she stood at the kitchen window watching the darkness begin to lighten over the barn. At 5:30, Colton came in from his first round of checks. She heard the boots on the porch, the door, the particular sounds of a man moving through his own house without thinking about it. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "You're up early?" he said. "I always am," she said. "I made coffee." "I hope that's all right. I didn't know where everything was. I had to look through 3 cabinets." "That's fine." He came in and poured himself a cup and stood at the other side of the kitchen, and they both looked out the window at the gray-pink line of dawn beginning along the ridge. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said. "You?" "Enough." Neither of them said what they were both aware of, that this was the first morning of something neither of them had a word for yet, and that they were both uncertain, and that uncertainty was its own kind of acknowledgement. "Rosa usually starts breakfast at 6, he said. "You don't have to—" "I'd like to help," Claire said, "if she'll have me. I'm better in a kitchen than I am at sitting still." "I'll warn you, she's particular." "So am I," Clara said. "We'll either get along or we won't." Colton studied her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize, something thoughtful and not unkind. "I think you'll get along," he said. The first week was hard in the way that first weeks are, full of small, grating adjustments, the friction of 2 people learning the rhythms of each other's existence in a space they hadn't yet negotiated. Colton was not easy to know. Clara had understood this from his letters, where he was precise and measured and never said more than he meant. But the living version of it was more pronounced. He moved through his own house with a self-contained quietness that could read as coldness to someone who didn't look carefully. He was not cold. She could tell the difference. But he was a man who had been alone long enough that he had organized his interior life the way you organize a room you've stopped expecting company in. Everything in its place, efficient, closed. Clara was not a woman who needed to be entertained. She'd had 11 years of managing her father's house, which had been a quiet and largely solitary existence. But she noticed things. The way Colton ate his meals quickly and always looked slightly surprised when he sat down to a table that had been properly set. The way the ranch hand spoke to him with respect that had some warmth in it, not just compliance. The way he handled the horses with a patience and attention that he didn't always show people. On the third day, she reorganized the kitchen pantry. She did it in the morning while Rosa was out back dealing with something, and when Rosa came back and opened the pantry door, there was a very long pause. "I should have asked first," Claire said, from across the kitchen, where she was peeling potatoes and had not turned around. Another pause. Then, "You put the dried goods on the left. They're closer to the prep table from the left. You take fewer steps." Silence. Then the sound of the pantry being inspected more thoroughly. Then, the spices. By frequency of use, not alphabetical. The ones you use every day are at eye level. Rosa closed the pantry. She came and stood at the counter beside Clara and picked up a potato and a peeler without saying anything, and they worked together in silence for several minutes. "You've run a kitchen before," Rosa said. 11 years, Clara said. Rosa said, which was, Clara was learning, Rosa's version of a compliment. The town of Harwick had a population of roughly 400 people and the social architecture of any small frontier community, which is to say everyone knew everyone's business. The relationships between families were layered with years of accumulated favor and grievance, and the arrival of a new person was a significant event that got discussed thoroughly before any opinion was made official. Colton Hayes marrying, or whatever this arrangement technically was, through a matrimonial agency was significant. That he'd chosen a woman from Iowa that nobody knew was more significant. That she was, by the account of 3 women who had been at the Harwick station on the afternoon of her arrival, plain-featured and modestly dressed, was the most significant of all. Harwick had certain expectations about Colton Hayes. He was the wealthiest man in the county, which in frontier arithmetic made him a resource. His patronage mattered to the dry goods merchant and the blacksmith and the hotel owner and the local doctor. He was also a widower, which in the social calculus of frontier women of a certain ambition made him a prospect. There had been, in the 6 years since Margaret's death, a series of attempts by various families to position daughters, nieces, and cousins in his vicinity. He had been consistently, politely, and completely oblivious to all of them. So when the word spread, as word always spread in Harwick, through the mechanism of every errand and every post office visit and every Sunday gathering, that Colton Hayes had sent for a mail-order bride, and that she was a plain woman from Iowa with no family connections and nothing to recommend her except some letters, the reaction was layered and complicated and not entirely charitable. Clara noticed this on her first visit to Harwick, which happened 12 days after her arrival, when Colton took her in the wagon to introduce her to the town and handle some ranch business. She had been introduced to towns before. She knew how to read a room or a main street. She felt the adjustments in people's expressions as she and Colton moved from the blacksmith to the dry goods to the post office. The particular way a smile stayed at the surface level, not going deeper. The extra half-second of assessment before a greeting. The way eyes moved between her and Colton with a calculation they tried to hide and didn't quite manage. She said nothing about it. She was polite and composed, and she shook hands with the people Colton introduced her to, and she answered questions directly when they were asked. In the dry goods store, a woman named Elaine Forsythe, the wife of the man who ran the town's largest supply business, looked at Clara the way a person looks at something that has been incorrectly labeled at market. "How lovely that you've settled in," she said to Clara, with a warmth that was entirely structural. "Colton, you must bring her to the Whitfield dinner next month. It's the social event of the winter." "We'll see," Colton said. "Of course." Elaine's gaze moved over Clara once more in that particular way, And then she turned to Colton and began asking him about his north pasture fence, as though Clara had ceased to exist. Clara turned and looked at a display of fabric on the far wall. She ran her fingers over a piece of blue wool and said nothing. Behind her, she could hear Colton answering Elaine's questions with monosyllables that got shorter as the conversation went on. In the wagon on the way home, he said, "She's like that with everyone." "She's not," Clara said pleasantly, "but thank you for saying so." A pause. "No," he admitted, "she's not." "I've dealt with worse," Clara said. And she had. She knew what she was walking into when she'd agreed to come here. She had not expected warmth. She had not expected easy acceptance. She had come because the alternative, another decade in Cedar Falls, in the house that no longer belonged to her, trying to figure out what she was supposed to do with the remainder of her life, was worse. What she had not entirely accounted for was that the man sitting beside her in the wagon would turn out to be a person she was genuinely coming to respect. By the end of February, Clara had established something resembling a routine. She rose before dawn and started the kitchen fire. She and Rosa had reached a working equilibrium that had the particular efficient quality of two skilled people who've decided to stop competing and start collaborating. Rosa handled the heavy ranch cooking, the scale of it, the 20-man breakfasts, and the slaughter week feasts. Clara handled the detail work, the baking and the putting up, and the more finicky preparations that Rosa openly admitted she didn't have patience for. She'd begun keeping the household accounts, which Colton had been doing in a ledger with the kind of functional but approximate bookkeeping of a man who was good with cattle and adequate with numbers. She sat down with the ledger one evening, added up 3 months' worth of entries, found 2 errors that had balanced each other out by coincidence and one that hadn't, and left a note on top of the ledger that said only, "I've corrected the March figures. Let me know if you want me to explain how." He came in late from checking the cattle and found the note in the corrected ledger, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment reading it. "You know bookkeeping?" he said. "My father ran a small hardware business," she said, without looking up from the bread she was shaping. "I kept his books for 8 years. Another pause. "Can I ask, what did you think of my accounting?" "Functional," she said. "You never went badly wrong. You just weren't precise. Would you want to—" He stopped. "Yes," she said, "if you'd like me to." She heard him pull out a chair at the table. "I've been meaning to ask, is this working for you? I know it's not what you expected. It's not—" He stopped again, and she could hear him trying to find words that were honest but not clumsy. "I know I'm not the easiest man to live with." She set the bread aside and wiped her hands on her apron and turned to look at him. He was sitting at the table with his coat still on, hat in his hands, looking like a man who had started a sentence he wasn't sure how to finish. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "Colton," he said. "Please, Colton." She considered what was true and what was useful and whether those were the same thing. "I came here expecting nothing," she said. "That's not entirely accurate. I came here expecting it to be hard and awkward, and possibly a mistake. What I've found is that it's hard and awkward, but I don't think it's a mistake." She paused. "Is it working for you?" He looked at her. "You corrected my books and reorganized the pantry and made peace with Rosa inside a week," he said. "My last 3 ranch hands couldn't make peace with Rosa. I'd say it's working." "That's a low bar," she said. "It's an honest one," he said. And then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that. But it was there. Clara turned back to her bread. She was aware that something had shifted slightly in the quality of the silence between them. She didn't examine it too closely. She had learned over years not to examine things that were going well too closely. You had to let them breathe. March brought the kind of weather the Powder River Basin specialized in. Several days of deceptive warmth followed by a savage return of winter that caught everyone wrong-footed. The cattle needed extra management. The fence line along the eastern boundary buckled again, and Colton came in from 3 days of outdoor work looking like he had been personally defeated by the landscape. He sat down at the kitchen table at 8 in the evening with mud on his boots and his coat and a long cut along his left hand from a fence wire that Clara saw immediately. "Let me look at that," she said. "It's fine." "It's not fine. There's mud in it." She was already at the cabinet where she'd organized the household medical supplies. Another reorganization that had been accepted without comment. She came back with clean cloth and a bottle of carbolic and a basin of water. He submitted to this with the particular bad grace of a man who doesn't like being tended to, but is too tired to argue effectively. She cleaned the cut. It was deeper than he'd let on, and she did not say so, and wrapped it properly, and he sat still throughout and looked at the wall. "You should have come in hours ago," she said. "The cattle are not worth your hand," she said. "You're no use to the cattle if you lose the use of your fingers." He looked down at the wrapped hand. "You sound like Margaret," he said, and then went very still, like a man who has said something he immediately regrets. Clara finished tying off the bandage. "Is that all right?" she asked. "To sound like her?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said. I don't talk about her much." "You don't have to. She was good at this," he said. "Fixing things. She was better with people than I am, better at making a place feel lived in." He looked at the kitchen. "She would have liked what you've done with this room." Clara looked at the kitchen too. The clean shelves, the organized pantry, the small herbs she'd started in pots on the windowsill in a bid for spring. "Tell me about her," she said, "if you want." It came out haltingly, the way things do when they haven't been said in a long time. Margaret had been from a ranching family, had grown up knowing this life. She'd been quick and loud and full of opinions about everything. She'd been sick for 2 years before she died, a slow disease that had taken her lungs, and those 2 years had been the worst of Colton's life. Not because of the loss at the end, but because of watching someone who had been vivid and present become gradually absent while still physically there. Clara listened. She did not offer comparisons or consolations. She made him a plate of food while he talked and set it in front of him without comment, and he ate without seeming to notice, and talked. When he stopped, there was a silence that was different from the usual silence of the house, less weighted. He looked at the empty plate with a slightly surprised expression. "I didn't mean to go on that long," he said. "You didn't go on too long," she said. "Eat something else if you want." He did. She sat across from him with her own cup of coffee and didn't say much. And the kitchen was warm and the wind was pushing hard against the outside of the house, and that was the first evening that felt to Clara like something she hadn't had in 11 years. Not romance. Nothing so neat as that, just the particular warmth of not being alone in a room. The trouble when it arrived had the shape of a Sunday afternoon visitor. Her name was Vivian Ashworth, and she arrived in a hired carriage from Harwick on the second Sunday of March, and she was everything Clara was not, tall and elegantly assembled, with a pale coat that had no mended elbows and a way of moving through a doorway as though she had calculated the exact angle required to make the best impression. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the carriage arrive. She came to the front window and looked out, and felt something go cold and still in her chest. She knew Vivian Ashworth. Not well. They had never been friends, had never moved in the same circles because their circles had never intersected. But Cedar Falls was not a large town, and Vivian had been the daughter of the banker, and Clara had been the daughter of the hardware man who owed money to the bank. And some dynamics require no formal introduction to make themselves known. More specifically, Clara knew that Vivian knew the story. The story that Clara had spent 3 years trying to put enough distance between herself and to make the journey to Wyoming feel possible. She heard Colton open the front door. She heard Vivian's voice, warm and carrying, the voice of a woman who had never had to lower it to be heard. "Colton Hayes, I heard you'd taken a wife, and I didn't believe it until Foster Briggs told me himself. I'm passing through on my way to see my cousin in Cheyenne, and I simply had to stop." Clara untied her apron. She smoothed her dress. She walked into the front room. Vivian turned when she entered, and Clara watched Vivian's expression do the thing, the small, precise recalibration. The surprise managed and contained and repacked into something that looked like warmth, but wasn't. "Clara," Vivian said, "my goodness, I had no idea it was you." "Vivian," Clara said, "it's been a while." "It has, hasn't it?" Vivian looked between the two of them with an expression of bright attention. "Colton, I hope you know what a small world the frontier is. Clara and I are practically old friends." "We know each other from Cedar Falls," Clara said, which was true, and contained everything and nothing. Colton looked between them with the expression of a man reading a situation he doesn't have full information about. "I'll have Rosa put on coffee," he said. Vivienne stayed 2 hours. She was charming and precise, and she told 3 stories in that time, each of which was framed as a fond memory or a casual observation, and each of which embedded a small piece of the story Clara had been hoping was too far away to follow her here. The first was about a man named Thomas Hale, said lightly, as a name dropped in passing, in the context of a story about a Cedar Falls social event. But Clara saw Colton register the unfamiliarity, the way his attention sharpened slightly. The second was about a misunderstanding that had caused poor Clara such trouble, phrased with a sympathy that was architectural, designed to raise the question without being seen to raise it. The third was the direct one. Vivienne looked at Clara over her coffee cup and said, with a small smile that had been calibrated to appear kind, "You must tell Colton the whole story someday, Clara. It reflects well on you that you've recovered so beautifully." The room was very quiet. Colton looked at Clara. Clara looked at Vivienne with an expression that she had spent years perfecting, composed, unhurried, giving nothing away. "I'll walk you to your carriage," Clara said. She did not phrase it as an offer. Outside at the carriage, with the wind moving cold off the flat ground, Vivienne looked at her with the mask off. "You didn't tell him," Vivienne said. "It wasn't relevant," Clara said. "He'll find out. People talk." "People always talk," Clara said. "The story they tell depends on who tells it first." Vivienne studied her for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Not quite respect, but a recognition of a harder thing. "He's better than Thomas," she said. "I'll give you that." "Yes," Clara said. "He is." She watched the carriage go. She stood in the cold for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then she went back inside and she went to find Colton. He was in the office, standing at the window. He turned when she came in. "You don't have to explain anything," he said before she could speak. "I know," she said. "I want to." She sat down, and she told him. Thomas Hale had been a merchant in Cedar Falls, a prosperous one, handsome and well-liked, and he had courted Clara for 4 months when she was 29. She had believed him serious. He had not been serious. When he ended it, he had done so publicly and in terms that were designed to protect his own reputation at the expense of hers, suggesting that Clara had misread a friendship for something it was not, that she had been foolish enough to think a man of his standing had meant it, and that she had become difficult when corrected. The story had spread through Cedar Falls with the efficiency that small towns achieve with embarrassing information, and for 3 years afterward, Clara had lived in a town that had a fixed idea of her as a woman who had overreached and paid for it. She told this to Colton without dramatics. The facts, clean and unvarnished, in the same way she'd written her first letter. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "He lied," Colton said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "And people believed him." "It was easier to believe him," she said. "He was charming, and I was—" She stopped. "I was what I am." Colton looked at her steadily. "What are you?" She met his eyes. "Plain," she said. "Practical. Not the kind of woman people assume men mean seriously." Another silence. Then Colton said, "I mean it seriously." It wasn't romantic. He said it the same way he said everything, measured and direct, not dressed up. But it landed with the weight of something that had been decided rather than declared. Clara looked at her hands in her lap. She was aware that her eyes were doing something she did not want them to do, and she held very still for a moment until they stopped. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. The wind pushed against the window. Outside, the last light was going out of the sky over the Powder River Basin, orange and cold and very large. Inside the office, in the house that had been too quiet for too long, 2 people sat in the particular silence of something that had shifted without ceremony, without fanfare, in the direction of something real. The story Colton didn't repeat it. That was the first thing Clara noticed in the days following Vivienne's visit. He did not bring it up again, did not reference it in conversation, did not treat her differently in any way she could measure. He was the same man he had been the morning before, moving through his days with the same economical purposefulness, asking her the same practical questions about the household, sitting at the same end of the kitchen table with his coffee going cold while he read his correspondence. She had half expected something to change. She wasn't sure what. Some softening, maybe? Some excess of consideration that would have been its own form of condescension. Or the opposite, a pulling back, a reassessment, the way some men recalibrated their behavior toward a woman once they understood her history. Thomas Hale had done the latter. He had taken the information she gave him in trust and used it to redraw the shape of her. Colton did neither. He filed it somewhere that was apparently not accessible from the surface of his daily behavior, and he went back to work. On Wednesday morning of that week, he asked her if she wanted to ride out with him to check the eastern fence line. "Can you ride?" he asked. It was not a loaded question, just practical. "Adequately," she said. "I haven't done it in a few years." "There's a mare in the second stall that won't give you any trouble," he said. "Get Rosa to pack something. We'll be out most of the morning." It was the first time he'd suggested she come along on ranch work, and Clara understood that this was, in Colton's language, a significant thing. She packed the saddlebag herself, told Rosa she'd be back by noon, and spent 20 minutes in the barn getting reacquainted with the mare, a steady gray animal named Opal, who regarded her with the impassive patience of a creature that had seen many inexperienced riders and had made her peace with it. The eastern fence line was 4 miles from the main house, out across terrain that was still snow-patched in the shaded hollows, and beginning to show the first uncertain green at the surface of the hillsides. The sky was the specific hard blue of early Wyoming spring that made distances look deceptive, everything seeming closer and more manageable than it was. Colton rode ahead and checked the wire and the posts while Clara held the horses, and then he showed her what to look for, which lean in a post meant trouble, how to read the ground for frost heave, where the creek flooding had undermined the base of the line last spring and was likely to do it again. He explained it without condescension, the way you'd explain something to a person you expected to understand it. She asked questions. He answered them. On the ride back, when the ranch was visible in the middle distance against the brown hills, he said, without preamble, "Vivian Ashworth. How long has she been in Wyoming?" "I don't know," Clara said. "I didn't know she'd left Iowa." "She mentioned she has a cousin in Cheyenne." "She has cousins everywhere she finds useful," Clara said, and then felt slightly ashamed of the sharpness. "That's unkind. She's not a bad person. She's just—" "Careful," Colton said. "Yes." Clara watched Opal's ears. "Careful." "She'll talk," he said. It wasn't a warning, more like a statement of weather conditions. "I know," Clara said. "She already will have." He was quiet for a moment, riding. Then, "Does it bother you?" Clara considered that honestly. "It used to bother me more than it does now," she said. "In Cedar Falls it was suffocating. Here." She looked at the wide space around them, the enormous, indifferent sky. "It's still unpleasant, but there's more room to breathe around it." "Harwick's not Cedar Falls," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it's still a town." Harwick in March was beginning to shake off winter in the grudging way of frontier towns that had learned not to trust warm weather before April. The streets were mud-churned and the boardwalks were patchy with ice in the early mornings, and the social life of the town contracted and expanded with the weather in a rhythm that Clara was starting to understand. She went into town twice a week for supplies and post, usually alone, occasionally with Rosa, who had her own errands and her own relationships in town that predated Clara's arrival by nearly 2 decades. Rosa's presence was useful, not as protection exactly, but as context. Rosa knew everyone, and everyone knew Rosa, and whatever Rosa's opinion of Clara was, the fact of her accompanying her was its own form of endorsement. But Rosa was not always available, and Clara went alone often enough to know exactly where she stood in the social architecture of Harwick. The women who were polite but not warm. The women who were warm but whose warmth felt provisional, the kind that could be recalled. The women who had daughters of marriageable age or nieces who had been positioned in Colton's vicinity, who looked at Clara with a specific variety of assessment that had nothing to do with her personally and everything to do with what she represented. She had taken something off the table. She understood that this was unforgivable to certain people regardless of her behavior, and she had made her peace with it. What she had not entirely made her peace with was Elaine Forsythe. Elaine's husband ran the largest supply operation in the county, which meant that Elaine herself occupied a particular social altitude in Harwick, not the highest, but high enough, and she maintained it with the specific energy of a woman who has studied the rules of a hierarchy and excelled at playing by them. She was not openly cruel. She was worse than that. She was consistently, precisely, socially dismissive in a way that left no fingerprints. The incident that mattered happened on the second Friday of March, when Clara went to the dry goods store to pick up an order Colton had placed and found Elaine Forsythe there with two other women, Harriet Cole, the doctor's wife, and a younger woman named Dorothea Marsh, whose husband managed the Harwick Bank. They were discussing, when Clara came in, the upcoming Whitfield dinner. It was the first large social gathering of the season, hosted by the Whitfield family, who owned the second largest ranch in the county and used the dinner as an occasion to consolidate their social position in the manner of people who understood that status required regular maintenance. "Clara," Elaine said, in the tone of a woman who has just noticed a piece of furniture. "Are you and Colton attending the Whitfield dinner?" "I'm not sure," Clara said. She was at the counter collecting her order, keeping her back mostly to the conversation. "You really should," Harriet Cole said, with a warmth that was at least partially genuine. Harriet was one of the less calculated women in Harwick's social landscape, which made her both easier and harder to deal with, because her good intentions did not always produce useful results. It would be a good opportunity to meet people properly. "Colton hasn't mentioned it," Clara said. "He never goes to anything," Dorothea Marsh said with the confidence of someone who had known Colton Hayes longer than Clara had. "He went to the Whitfield dinner twice after Margaret died, I think, and then stopped. He's not social." "He might go this year," Elaine said, and the tone of it was so precisely angled that it took Clara a half-second to locate the edge. Implying because you are there. Implying because you need it. Implying because you are not the kind of woman who comes with her own social standing and therefore requires the legitimacy of being seen beside him. Clara picked up her order. She turned around. She looked at Elaine Forsythe directly, which she had learned was the only effective response to Elaine's particular brand of social weapon. Not because it disarmed her, but because it declined to pretend the weapon wasn't there. "Thank you for the suggestion," Clara said. "I'll mention it to him." She left. On the boardwalk outside, she stood for a moment in the cold air with her package under her arm, and she breathed carefully, the way you breathe when you have said exactly what you intended and no more. It was fine. She was fine. She had been doing this for 3 years in Cedar Falls, and she could do it in Harwick. The geography had changed, the arithmetic had not. She walked to the wagon and drove home and said nothing about it to Colton. But she did mention the dinner. That evening, after supper, when the kitchen was cleaned and Rosa had gone to her room and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, she brought it up as a practical matter. "Elaine Forsythe asked if we were going to the Whitfield dinner," she said. "In April, I think." Colton was at the table with the ledger open, reviewing the accounts she'd organized. He looked up. "She did." "I said I didn't know." "I'm asking now." He considered the question with the expression of a man who finds social events genuinely unpleasant rather than strategically avoidable. "Do you want to go?" "I'm asking what you want," she said. "I asked first." Clara set down the cup she'd been drying. "I think it might be useful," she said. "Not enjoyable, but useful. If I'm going to live here, I should know more people than I currently do, and this seems like a faster way to accomplish that than individual introductions over the course of a year." He studied her. "You're not going because you want to." "No," she said. "I'm going because it's the pragmatic thing to do." "Harwick's social events are a particular kind of misery," he said, with feeling. "I've survived worse," she said. A pause. "I haven't gone since—" "In a few years," he said. "I know. People mentioned it." He closed the ledger. He looked at the table for a moment, and she could see him working through it. The calculation of what it cost him versus what it might be worth. He was not a man who did things for appearances, which was admirable, and also occasionally inconvenient. "All right," he said. "We'll go." "You don't have to shoot it." "Clara," he said, "if you're going to go to that dinner and stand in a room full of people who are deciding whether or not to accept you, you're not going alone." She looked at him. He had gone back to the ledger with the expression of a man who has said his piece and considers the matter settled. She felt something move through her chest that she did not examine too closely. "Thank you," she said. Don't thank me, he said. I hate those dinners. Boy. April came in with genuine warmth, and the ranch transformed in the way that ranches do in spring, suddenly and completely, as though the landscape had been waiting with a great deal of impatience. The pastures greened fast, the cattle came out of their winter lethargy, and the work multiplied accordingly. There was calving to manage, branding to prepare for, 2 sections of fence along the north boundary that needed rebuilding before the herd expanded into that pasture. Colton was out from before dawn until past dark on most days, and Clara saw less of him in this period than she had through the winter. But the shape of the household had changed enough that his absence felt different from what it might have felt like in January. Less like an empty house, and more like a house where the person who lived in it was elsewhere temporarily. She kept the accounts and managed the household and worked in the kitchen with Rosa, and she started a kitchen garden in the patch of ground behind the house that had been given over to weeds, which Rosa watched with the expression of someone who has given up saying, "I told you so," and was simply waiting to be proved right. She also began tentatively to cook in a different way, not the ranch cooking, the large-scale practical feeding of working men that Rosa managed with the efficiency of a quartermaster. Something separate. She had a skill she hadn't used fully since her father's hardware store had hosted its occasional dinner for business contacts, and she found herself with access, for the first time in years, to the quality of ingredients that made the skill matter. She started small. A particular apple cake that had been her mother's, adapted for the altitude and the different flour. A proper soup stock instead of the standard one, using bones she'd requested from the butcher in a specific way. A biscuit recipe she'd refined over years to a consistency that she knew, without vanity, was better than most she'd encountered. The ranch hands noticed. They started appearing at the kitchen door at odd hours with questions that were transparently pretexts. Rosa noticed the ranch hands noticing, and her expression, when she thought Clara wasn't looking, had acquired a quality that in a different woman might have been called pride. Colton noticed too, though he said less about it than anyone. He came in one evening during calving week, exhausted, muddy, with the particular bone-tired quality of a man who has been doing physical labor in uncertain weather for 6 days straight, and sat down at the table, and Clara set in front of him a bowl of soup that was nothing fancy, just the good stock and some vegetables and the last of the winter's dried herbs, but made with the precision of someone who understood what tired tasted like and what it needed. He ate half the bowl before he said anything. Then he looked up. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother," she said, and then years of practice. "It's not—" He paused, looking for the word. "Most cooking is just fuel. This is something else." Clara sat down across from him with her own cup. "That's a generous thing to say." "It's an accurate thing to say," he said, with the particular stubbornness of a man who does not want to be credited for generosity when he believes he's just stating facts. She looked at him. This large, quiet, difficult man who had become over 3 months, someone she understood better than she'd understood most people in years. "Colton," she said, "do you know what the ranch hands call you behind your back?" He looked wary. "What?" "Old stone," she said, "because they say you're solid all the way through and impossible to move." He was quiet. "Is that a complaint?" "No," she said. "I think they mean it admiringly. I'm just saying. I understand now why they say it." She picked up her cup. "You're harder to know than most people, but once you know what you're looking at, it's—" She stopped. "What?" he said. "Reliable," she said, "which is rarer than it sounds." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the night was full of the ordinary sounds of a working ranch. The calving pens, the horses in the barn, the wind over the flat ground. Colton Hayes, sitting at his kitchen table, looked like a man who had just been handed something he didn't know how to hold but was not going to put down. "The Whitfield dinner's in 2 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to need you to tell me what to do when Elaine Forsythe corners me," he said, "because she always corners me, and I have never in my life managed that situation without saying something that costs me." Clara felt, against her better judgment, the specific warmth of genuine amusement. "I'll stay within arm's reach," she said. "If she corners you, look at me." And then I'll come over and interrupt her with something domestic and unthreatening, and she won't be able to object without being obviously rude." He stared at her. You've thought about this. I've survived small towns for 34 years, she said. I've had time to develop strategies. The corner of his mouth moved, the same small, restrained thing she'd seen once or twice before. All right, he said. I'll look for you. The Whitfield dinner was held at the Whitfield Ranch, which was the kind of operation that had been designed to impress. The main house built on a scale that was less about function and more about statement. The grounds kept with a care that required labor specifically allocated to appearance rather than productivity. James Whitfield was in his 50s, a large man with a senator's handshake and a manner that suggested he had been told for so long that he was important that he had stopped questioning it. His wife, Lucinda, was a different matter, quieter than her husband, with observant eyes and a graciousness that Clara suspected was more genuine than most of what passed for it in the room. Lucinda Whitfield had the particular poise of a woman who had spent decades being the most capable person in rooms that credited her husband for it, and had arrived at a relationship with that injustice that was not quite acceptance and not quite defiance, but something more functional than either. She greeted Clara at the door with a warmth that was specific rather than general, which was the clearest sign of authenticity Clara had learned to look for. Clara Hayes, she said, and it was the first time anyone outside the ranch had called her that, and Clara felt the sound of it in a way she hadn't anticipated. I'm so glad you came. We've all been wanting to meet you properly. We all was an exaggeration, but a generous one. Clara thanked her and went inside on Colton's arm and let the room assess her. It was a large gathering, 40 or 50 people, the upper tier of the county's ranching and merchant class, dressed in their best with varying degrees of comfort. The room smelled of pine smoke and candle wax, and the particular mixture of good food and effort that marked an important occasion. Clara had worn her best dress, which she was aware was not impressive by the standards of the room. It was a deep blue wool, clean and well-fitted, and she had done what she could with her hair, which was never going to be remarkable. She had decided in the wagon on the way over that she was not going to pretend she looked like something she didn't, and that the only performance available to her was the one she'd always had, showing up, being present, and not flinching. Colton stayed close. He was not, she noticed, the natural social animal that some wealthy men were. He didn't work the room, didn't glad hand, held his drink without drinking much of it, and spoke when spoken to. Several men came to him for conversation about cattle prices and land values and water rights, and he engaged with these subjects fluently, and Clara listened and occasionally contributed in a way that was careful enough not to draw attention, but substantive enough that the men addressing Colton began, one by one, to include her in the conversation. Elaine Forsythe arrived at 8 o'clock with her husband Gerald, who was a square, mild man with the demeanor of someone accustomed to standing next to his wife rather than beside her. Elaine surveyed the room with the efficiency of a general assessing a battlefield, and her eyes found Clara within the first 30 seconds. She made her approach gradually. 2 other conversations first, working toward them with the patience of someone who understood that directness was less effective than inevitability. When she arrived in their orbit, she was all warmth. Colton and Clara. Don't you both look well? Clara looked at Colton. He looked at Clara. The corner of his eye contracted slightly, acknowledging the signal. She had told him she would handle it, and she had meant it, but the way he looked at her in that moment was the look of a man who was prepared to back her up. Elaine, Clara said, your dress is beautiful. Is that from the new shipment at Forsythe's? It was a small maneuver, redirecting Elaine to her own territory, which Elaine would find difficult to leave quickly without appearing rude. Elaine blinked, recalibrated. It is, she said. Gerald had it brought specially. The color suits you, Clara said, and moved the conversation smoothly to Gerald's business, and then to the upcoming cattle drive, and by the time they moved away, Elaine had not landed the blow she'd come over to deliver. Clara could see the frustration at the edge of her composed expression, and she filed it under, not resolved, only postponed. That was well done, Colton said quietly, when Elaine was out of earshot. She'll try again, Clara said equally quietly. I know, he said. But not tonight, boss. The dinner itself was where things shifted in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. Lucinda Whitfield had placed them at a table with the Harwick doctor, a man named Ellsworth, serious and careful in the way of men whose work made them precise, and his wife Harriet, and 2 other couples Clara hadn't met. The food was competent and plentiful, The kind of dinner that demonstrated wealth through volume rather than craft, which Clara noted without judgment. During the meal, the conversation turned to food in the way that conversations at large meals sometimes do, specifically to the problem of the county fair in September, which the previous year had been a disaster when the woman in charge of the harvest supper had taken ill and the replacement had produced a meal that 3 people at the table were still describing with wounded expressions. "It needs someone who actually knows what they're doing," Harriet Cole said, with the directness of a woman who had been trying to say this for months. "Not someone who volunteers because they want the credit." "The credit," Dr. Ellsworth said, "is why no one competent volunteers. The competent people know what's involved." Clara was quiet for this exchange. She was listening in the way she listened to most things, absorbing, filing, not ready yet to say anything. Lucinda Whitfield, at the head of the table, looked at Clara with the observant eyes she'd noticed at the door. "I've been hearing things about your cooking from Rosa Alvarez," she said, directly enough that it couldn't be deflected as a compliment. "Rosa is generous," Clara said. "Rosa is not generous at all," Lucinda said. "That's what makes it meaningful." Several people at the table laughed. Clara felt something unfamiliar move through her. Not quite embarrassment, not quite pleasure. Something in between that was close to being seen accurately. "I can cook," she said. "I don't know if that's a solution to your fair problem." "It might be part of one," Lucinda said. And then, smoothly, she moved the conversation on, and Clara was left with the sense that something had been planted in the room that had not been there when she arrived. On the drive home, under a sky full of stars that the wide Wyoming plain made look close enough to touch, Colton drove, and Clara sat beside him, and they were quiet for a while with the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have survived the same experience and don't need to debrief immediately. "Lucinda Whitfield likes you," he said. "She's more perceptive than her husband," Clara said. "Everyone is more perceptive than her husband," Colton said, in a tone that was so flat and matter-of-fact that Clara laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind she hadn't produced much of in recent years. Colton looked at her. In the dark, with the stars overhead and the wagon moving at its steady pace, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, but which had something in it that was, she wasn't sure. Warm, maybe. Something in the vicinity of warm. "You did well tonight," he said. "So did you," she said. "I did nothing. I stood next to you and held a drink." "That was exactly what was needed," she said. "You don't always need to do more than stand your ground." He considered this. "Is that what I was doing?" "That's what I was doing," she said. "You were doing it beside me. That's what mattered." The horse moved steadily through the dark. The ranch was 20 minutes ahead of them, the lights visible as a cluster of warm yellow against the black of the plains. Clara thought about the room she'd walked into tonight, the assessments, the precise social machinery, the way Elaine Forsyth's eyes had followed her at intervals throughout the evening. She thought about Lucinda Whitfield's direct gaze and Rosa's apparently having said something to the right person. She thought about the way Colton had looked at her during the exchange with Elaine. Not protective. She had not needed protection and would not have welcomed it. Something else. The look of a man who was paying attention, who had decided the person beside him was worth watching, who found what he saw there something other than disappointing. She had spent 3 years in Cedar Falls being managed, being assessed and found wanting, and then managed. Handled with the particular careful condescension reserved for women who had embarrassed themselves by expecting too much. She had not known, until she sat in a wagon driving home under Wyoming stars with her composure still intact, how much of that she had been carrying, how heavy it had been, how different it felt to set it down, even partially. "Colton," she said. Thank you for tonight." He was quiet for a moment. "I told you not to thank me." "I know," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." He made a sound that wasn't quite a grunt and wasn't quite a laugh. The wagon rolled on through the dark. "What?" 3 days after the Whitfield dinner, a letter arrived from Cedar Falls. It was addressed to Clara, and she recognized the handwriting on the envelope. Angular and deliberate, the handwriting of a woman who had been taught penmanship by someone strict and had never unlearned it. It was from a woman named Patrice Hale, Thomas Hale's sister. Clara stood in the front hallway with the letter in her hand for a long moment before she opened it. She had not heard from anyone in Cedar Falls since she'd left, which was precisely what she'd wanted. She had left a forwarding address with the post office because she was not the kind of person who disappeared without a trace, but she had not expected the trace to be followed so quickly. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first was preamble. How Patrice had heard Clara was in Wyoming, how she hoped the journey had been well, how Cedar Falls was unchanged and the spring was coming in late. The second paragraph was the reason for the letter. Thomas, Patrice wrote, was engaged to be married. A woman from Des Moines. A merchant's daughter. The wedding was in June. The third paragraph was the one that mattered. I write this not to cause you pain, but because I thought you deserved to know, and because I have never believed what my brother said about you. He was not honest, Clara. I knew it then, and I know it now. I hope Wyoming has been kind to you. I hope you have found something better than what Cedar Falls had to offer. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the pocket of her apron and went back to the kitchen. Rosa looked at her when she came in with the accuracy of a woman who had been reading people for 60 years. Bad news? She said. Old news, Clara said. There's a difference. Rosa made the sound that was her version of acceptance and went back to what she was doing. Clara started the bread. The familiar rhythm of it, the flour, the water, the kneading, was what she needed. Something she could do with her hands while her mind processed the letter in the pocket of her apron. Thomas was getting married. She found, sitting with the fact, that it produced less feeling than she expected. Not grief, she had grieved that 3 years ago, and what she'd grieved was less Thomas himself than what he had cost her. What it produced was a kind of tired recognition, the sense of a door closing that had already been mostly shut. Patrice had believed her. She hadn't known that. She filed it alongside Lucinda Whitfield's directness, and Rose's reported words to the right person, and Colton's look in the wagon under the Wyoming stars. A small collection of evidence against the verdict Cedar Falls had returned. Colton came in at noon for water and found her at the table with flour on her hands and an expression he apparently found readable enough to warrant a question. What happened? A letter from Cedar Falls, she said. Nothing urgent. He poured his water and stood at the counter. Good letter or bad letter? Neither, she said. Just old. He looked at her for a moment. He had learned, she'd noticed this, not to push. He asked once, directly, and if she answered the way she'd just answered, he left it there. It was one of the things about him that she had come to genuinely value, because it was rarer than it should have been. There's something I want to talk to you about, she said, about the county fair. He looked mildly surprised at the change of subject, but settled into it. What about it? Lucinda Whitfield brought it up at the dinner, she said. The harvest supper. It sounds like it needs proper organization. It always does, he said. I'd like to offer to help with it, she said. Not for the credit, for... She stopped and looked at the bread on the table and tried to find the honest version of what she meant. I've been cooking in this kitchen for 3 months, she said, and it's a good kitchen, and you've been generous, but I need something of my own, something I did that's mine. In this town. He was quiet for a moment. That's straightforward, he said. I'm a straightforward person, she said. I know, he said. It came out with something in it. Not softness exactly, because Colton Hayes was constitutionally incapable of softness, but something in the vicinity. An acknowledgement, an endorsement of the quality being named. I'll write to Lucinda, he said. Or you can, and I'll sign it. Either way. I'll write it, Clara said. I don't need you to sign. I know you don't, he said. But in this county, my name on a letter gets it opened faster. He said it without vanity. Just another practical observation, like how to read a fence post for frost heave. Use it or don't. Your choice. Clara looked at him. This man who had taken her in without ceremony, who had given her space without making a performance of it, who had stood beside her at the Whitfield dinner without requiring anything from her in return, who had just offered her his name as a resource without attaching a debt to it. She thought about the letter in her apron pocket. She thought about Thomas Hale and the 3 years in Cedar Falls and the way a story can follow a person through geography if they let it. She thought about the bread on the table and the accounts in the ledger and the herbs on the kitchen windowsill and the gray mare opal and the wide Wyoming sky that made other things feel less important. I'll sign it myself, she said. But thank you. He nodded. He put down his water glass and went back outside, and Clara went back to the bread. and the kitchen was warm and smelled of flour and the particular promise of something rising. Lucinda Whitfield wrote back within the week. Her letter was brief and direct, which Clara had come to expect from her, a quality she appreciated more the longer she spent in a county where directness was treated as a liability rather than a virtue. Lucinda said that the Harvest Supper Committee was a loose and fractious organization that had been producing mediocre results for 4 years, that the woman who nominally led it, a Mrs. Adeline Greer, whose primary qualification was longevity rather than skill, was not going to relinquish control without resistance, and that Clara should expect friction. Then she said that she would make an introduction if Clara was willing, and that whatever Clara decided to do with the introduction was her own business. Clara read this letter at the kitchen table and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has been told the truth about a difficult situation and finds it preferable to comfortable fiction. She wrote back the same afternoon. She said she was willing to meet Mrs. Greer and willing to work within whatever structure existed, but that she had conditions. She would not be involved in a decorative capacity, and if her cooking was part of the supper, she needed genuine authority over the menu and the preparation. She was not, she wrote, interested in being the name behind someone else's decisions. Lucinda's response to this arrived 4 days later and was a single line. I told Adeline you were coming Thursday. Wear something you don't mind being judged in. Clara showed this to Colton over breakfast. He read it and handed it back. She's warning you, he said. I know, Clara said. It's useful to be warned. Adeline Greer has been running that supper since before Margaret and I came to this county, he said. She's not a pleasant person to disagree with. Few people are, Clara said. He looked at her over his coffee cup with the steady, measuring look she'd come to understand was how he expressed concern without wanting to call it that. You don't have to do this, he said. I know I don't have to, she said. That's not the point. He nodded. That was one of the things she valued about him. He understood the difference between you don't have to as a genuine offer and you don't have to as a suggestion to stand down, and he never confused the two. Mrs. Adeline Greer lived in a house in Harwick that had more decoration than the surrounding houses in the way that certain personalities accumulate objects, not for love of the objects themselves, but for the statement their accumulation made. She was a woman in her late 60s with a spine that appeared to have been constructed from something more rigid than bone, and she received Clara in her front parlor with the particular grace of a person who is being gracious only to the degree required by courtesy. Lucinda sat in the corner with the expression of a woman who had arranged a meeting and was now prepared to watch it without intervening. Mrs. Hayes, Adeline said. The name still landed with a small shock each time someone used it. Lucinda tells me you have some experience in cooking. I do, Clara said. The harvest supper is not a domestic occasion, Adeline said, with the precision of a woman who has been making this distinction for a long time. It feeds over 100 people. It requires organization, procurement, management of volunteers, and coordination with the fairgrounds. It is not, forgive me for being direct, it is not the same as cooking for a household, however accomplished one may be in that regard. Clara had been prepared for this. She had been prepared for some version of this her entire adult life. The version of the conversation that began with, forgive me for being direct, and then proceeded to say something that required no forgiveness, because it had been engineered to be defensible. You're right, Clara said. They're different skills. I have both. Adeline blinked. She had expected Clara could see either deference or friction, and had her responses loaded for both. A calm acknowledgement that conceded the point while declining to surrender it was a third option she hadn't prepared for. I kept accounts and managed supply for my father's business for 8 years, Clara continued. I've organized meals for large groups at county events in Iowa. I understand procurement and volunteer management, and I can cook at scale in a way that goes beyond competent. She paused. I'm not asking to take over your supper, Mrs. Greer. I'm asking to contribute something real. If that's not what you need, I'll stop taking up your Thursday afternoon. The room was very quiet. Lucinda was looking at the far wall with the expression of someone suppressing something. Adeline looked at Clara for a long moment with the appraisal of a woman who has spent decades sorting people and is not accustomed to finding the sorting complicated. The menu, she said finally. What would you do differently? It was not quite a question. Clara answered it as though it were. She described what she had in mind, not an overhaul, not a repudiation of what had come before, but a set of specific adjustments to the existing structure that would make the food better without making the organization unrecognizable. She had done her research, asking Rosa and Harriet Cole and the butcher's wife and 3 people she'd spoken to in the dry goods store what they remembered about the harvest supper and what they'd wished was different. Adeline listened. She did not show what she was thinking. When Clara finished, there was another silence. Thursday afternoons, Adeline said. Planning meetings. If you're going to be involved, you're going to all of them. I understand, Clara said. And the menu changes go through me, Adeline said. You propose. I approve. That's acceptable, Clara said. And you'll need to manage your own volunteers, Adeline said. I have enough to coordinate. Yes, Clara said. Adeline looked at her one more time, with an expression that had not softened exactly, but had shifted into something more considered. All right, she said. We'll see how it goes. In the carriage back to Lucinda's house, where she'd left her wagon, Lucinda said, I've never seen Adeline agree to anything on the first meeting. She didn't agree to everything, Clara said. She agreed to a trial. There's a difference. You sound like Colton, Lucinda said. He's precise about language, Clara said. It's useful. Lucinda looked at her with the observant eyes that were, Clara thought, her most defining characteristic. You've settled in, Lucinda said. Not a question. I'm still settling, Clara said. But yes, May moved through the ranch in a blur of work that left everyone with the particular exhaustion of a season that demanded too much at once. The branding was finished, the north fence rebuilt, and the cattle were distributed across the summer pastures in the complicated geometry that Colton managed with a map he kept in his head rather than on paper, and that Clara had begun to understand by listening to his conversations with the ranch hands. She attended the Thursday planning meetings in Harwick, which were exactly as difficult as Lucinda had implied. The committee consisted of 7 women, 3 of whom deferred entirely to Adeline, 2 of whom had their own agendas that had nothing to do with the supper, one of whom was Harriet Cole, who was genuinely competent and therefore useful, and one of whom was a young woman named Bess Archer, who had been assigned to the committee by her mother and spent most meetings looking at the window with the expression of someone who would rather be anywhere else. Clara found Bess more interesting than most of the others. After the 3rd meeting, when the room had cleared and Clara was helping Harriet collect the papers from the table, Bess came over and said, You actually know what you're talking about, don't you? About cooking? Clara said. About all of it, Bess said. The procurement, the timing, the quantities. You've done this before. Some version of it, Clara said. Bess looked at her with the frank assessment of a young woman who has been in rooms full of social performance for so long that she's developed an allergy to it. Can I work with you? She said. Not with the committee, with you. I can actually cook. My mother doesn't know, because if she did, she'd use it somehow, but I learned from our ranch cook, and I'm good at it. Clara studied her, this young woman with restless eyes and a directness she was keeping mostly contained. How good? Better than adequate, Bess said. Not as good as you, probably, but I learned fast. Clara considered this. Thursday afternoons, she said. Come to the ranch instead of the meeting. We'll find out how good. Bess's expression did something unguarded and genuine. Yes, she said. All right. Rosa, when informed of this arrangement, delivered her opinion in her characteristically efficient way. Another one who cooks in my kitchen, she said, looking at the ceiling. Your kitchen has been very patient, Clara said. My kitchen is not patient, Rosa said. My kitchen is suffering. But she made room. By June, the thing that had been building between Clara and Colton had become something neither of them had named, but both of them were aware of in the specific way of 2 careful people who have learned that naming things too early can damage them. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment. It was the accumulation of small things, the way he left the kitchen light on when he knew she'd be up late finishing the accounts, the way she started keeping a separate pot of coffee going past the hour. Rosa considered reasonable because Colton came in late from the summer cattle checks, and she had learned that he thought better with coffee than without. The way they had developed, without discussion, a habit of sitting on the porch in the late evening for half an hour before the working day officially ended, talking about nothing important. It was on the porch that most of the real conversation happened. That was where she learned that he had wanted to study engineering before his father's death had made him the ranch's operator at 22. That was where she told him about her mother, who had died when Clara was 12, and whose absence had shaped everything afterward in ways she'd spent years learning to articulate. That was where he told her, one warm evening in late June when the fireflies were just beginning to appear at the field's edge, that he had almost sold the ranch 2 years after Margaret died. "What stopped you?" she asked. He looked out at the field. "I couldn't figure out what I'd do instead," he said, "and I was too tired to make a permanent decision, so I kept going. And eventually keeping going became this." He gestured at the spread around them, in the way of a man who has something good and is not entirely comfortable with how much it means to him. "That's how most things work," Clara said. "You keep going until going is the thing itself." He looked at her. "Is that how you got here?" She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider most questions. "Partly," she said. "I also chose. There's a difference." She paused. "You chose too. You just don't like to admit that keeping the ranch was a choice you made." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I don't like to admit it." "Because admitting it means you wanted something," she said. "And wanting things is harder than just continuing." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to understand was his version of something felt strongly. "You do that," he said. "You take a thing apart until the true piece of it is visible." "Is that annoying?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Mostly no." She smiled. It was a real smile, not the composed kind she deployed in town, the unguarded one that she'd spent years keeping under control because unguarded things could be used against you. She was aware of showing it, and she was aware of deciding to anyway. He saw it. The quality of his stillness changed in a way that was nearly imperceptible, and that she had become, over months, precise enough to read. Neither of them said anything else. The fireflies were out in the field below the porch, small, cold lights moving at random through the darkness, and the evening was warm and the ranch was quiet around them. And the particular silence between them had changed into something that had weight and texture, but was not the heavy silence of the early months. It was the silence of something that had been decided without being said. It was the silence of something that had been decided without being said. And then, as these things do, it got complicated. The complication arrived in the form of a man named Gerald Marsh, the bank manager's brother-in-law, who had come to Harwick from Denver on business connected with a land purchase in the county, and who appeared at the Hayes Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon when Colton was out on the range and Clara was alone in the house except for Rosa. She did not know Gerald Marsh. She received him in the front parlor with the correct formality, offered coffee, and asked his business. His business, as he explained it over the coffee she regretted offering, was that he had heard about her cooking. He had eaten at the Whitfield dinner. He'd been in the county at the time, had attended as a guest, and had apparently spoken to enough people since to have formed a picture. He was, he explained, an investor with interests in several commercial ventures in Denver, and he was looking to expand into frontier towns that were growing. A restaurant, he said, with the directness of a man who had learned that bearing the point cost more time than it saved. A proper one. Not a boarding house kitchen. Something with a menu and a reputation. I've been looking for the right person to run it for a year. He looked at her with the assessing eyes of a man who evaluated everything for its return. I've been told you're the right person. Clara set down her cup. She looked at him carefully. He was not unpleasant. Not like Thomas Hale, not the kind of man who wore charm as a deliberate tool. He was businesslike, and he was presenting a real proposition, and she could see from the numbers he sketched that he'd thought about it. She was also aware, with the precision of a woman who had been underestimated so many times she'd developed a radar for it, that he had come on a Tuesday afternoon when Colton was away from the house. Whether that was calculation or coincidence, she wasn't sure, but she noted it. I appreciate the offer, she said. I'd need to discuss it with my husband before giving you any kind of answer. He nodded. Of course. I'll be in Harwick through the end of the month. He left his information and stood and shook her hand and left, and Clara sat in the front parlor for a moment after the door closed. She told Colton that evening, all of it, the man, the offer, the numbers, the Tuesday afternoon timing, and her own uncertain reading of whether the timing mattered. Colton listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for longer than usual. What do you want to do? He asked. I don't know, she said. That's why I'm telling you. What do you think of the offer? She considered. The money is real, she said. He's not a con man. The numbers he described are achievable, probably, if the location and the management are right. She paused. I also think he came when you weren't here because he thought I'd be easier to approach without you. Were you? No, she said. But I don't know if he knew that. Colton looked at the table. She could see him working through it, the layers of it, the offer itself, and the manner of it, and what it meant about how she was perceived and what her options were. There's something I should say, he said, and his voice had shifted into the register he used for things that mattered. This arrangement we have, it's worked. Better than I expected. Better than I deserve, probably. He stopped, started again. I didn't think, when I wrote to that agency, that I was... Another stop. You're not what I thought I was getting. What did you think you were getting? She asked carefully. Someone to help run the house, he said. Someone to make the quiet less. He looked at her. What I got is someone I'd be sorry to lose. The room was very still. Clara looked at this man who said difficult things sideways, who found the truth only after going around it twice, who had stood on a platform in winter and not given her the look she'd been dreading, who had sat in a kitchen and listened to her tell a story she was ashamed of, and then said, I mean it seriously, in the same voice he used to describe fence repairs. I'm not going to leave, she said. I'm not considering leaving. I know, he said. I'm trying to say... He pressed his mouth together. I want you to have something that's yours. A kitchen here isn't the same as your own kitchen. Your own name on something. She looked at him for a moment. You're not trying to talk me into his offer, she said. No, he said. I'm saying, whatever you want to build, I'll back it. Here. Not because you need my money, but because you should have someone standing behind you who's there because he chose to be. Clara sat with this. She sat with it the way she sat with difficult things, quietly, giving it room to settle. I don't want a restaurant funded by a man from Denver who came on a Tuesday, she said. I want... She stopped, found the honest version. I want to do the harvest supper first. I want to do it right and see what it tells me about what I can actually build. And then I want to decide from that. He nodded. That's sensible, he said. I know it's sensible, she said. I'm always sensible. It's occasionally a problem. The corner of his mouth moved. I'll write to Marsh tomorrow, he said. Tell him the answer is no for now. I'll write it, she said. I know you will, he said. I'm just saying I'll also write. 2 letters declining is more definitive than 1. She looked at him. You're protective of me, she said. Not an accusation, an observation. He stopped, looked at the table. Yes, he said. I suppose I am. I don't need protection, she said. I know, he said. But wanting to protect someone and thinking they need it are different things. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the summer evening was long and warm, the last of the light still holding in the western sky. The ranch sounds came in faintly through the open window. Horses, cattle, the particular piece of an operation running as it should. All right, she said. Write your letter. July brought the county fair preparations into their final and most difficult phase, which was the phase where everyone's good intentions began to collide with each other and produce friction. The Thursday committee meetings had become, under the accumulated pressure of decisions that needed making, significantly more contentious. Adeline Greer was resistant to 2 of the menu changes Clara had proposed: a cold salted beef preparation that could be made the day before and held properly, which would reduce the chaos of the day itself, and a dessert table that went beyond the standard pies into territory that Adeline described as unnecessary ambition. It's not ambition, Clara said in the 4th such meeting, keeping her voice level with the specific effort of a woman who has had this argument before in different rooms. It's planning. If we're not pulling the beef from the fire the morning of the fair, we have more capacity to manage the rest. We have always managed, Adeline said. We have always gotten through it, Harriet Cole said, with the quiet courage of a woman who had been in rooms with Adeline for a long time and had decided today was the day. That's not the same thing. The room shifted. Harriet's voice carried the weight of a person who almost never used it for conflict, which meant that when she did, the room paid attention. Adeline looked at Harriet, then at Clara, then at the table. "The beef preparation," she said. "We'll try it." "And the dessert table?" Clara asked. A pause. "Within reason," Adeline said, which was not yes, but was not no. Clara took it. She had learned, over months of Harwick's social landscape, that a half-victory held was worth more than a full victory contested. You built on the ground you'd taken. Bess Archer, sitting 2 seats away, caught Clara's eye and looked immediately back at the window. After the meeting, walking to her wagon, Clara heard quick footsteps behind her and turned to find Bess. "You didn't push for the full dessert table," Bess said. "Not yet," Clara said. "Why?" "Because I'll need Adeline's goodwill on the day itself," Clara said. "And I can build the table I want incrementally without making her feel replaced." She looked at Bess. "How's your pastry?" "Better than my mother's," Bess said. "Which isn't the bar you're asking about. I know. It's—" She made a gesture that was honestly self-assessing. "Good, not exceptional." "Work on your lamination," Clara said. "The layers. That's where most people lose it." "I know," Bess said. "I've been practicing." "Come Saturday morning," Clara said. "We'll work on it properly." Well, Elaine Forsythe came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late July. She did not send word ahead. She arrived in her carriage with the air of a woman who considered the giving of advance notice a courtesy she extended to social equals, and she was received by Clara in the front room with the composed courtesy that Clara had learned was her most effective defense. "I heard about the Marsh proposal," Elaine said, before the pleasantries had properly concluded. Clara set her cup down. "Did you?" "Harwick is a small county," Elaine said. "Gerald Marsh stayed at the Harwick Hotel. He talked." She looked at Clara with the precise attention she always deployed. "You turned it down." "We did," Clara said. "The restaurant idea," Elaine said. "You'd have been good at it." "I know," Clara said. That wasn't the issue. Elaine was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. She was a woman who managed silence the way a conductor managed pauses, for effect rather than uncertainty. The silence felt different. "I owe you an apology," she said, and the words came out with the effortful quality of something that had been prepared and was being delivered correctly despite the cost. Clara looked at her. "I was not welcoming when you arrived," Elaine said. It was unfair of me. You hadn't done anything to deserve it." "No," Clara said. "I hadn't." Elaine blinked. She had expected, Clara thought, something more accommodating. A rush of reassurance, a social release valve. Clara offered neither. She waited. "Colton Hayes is important to this county," Elaine said, which was the real version of the apology, stripped of its cover. "His business, his relationships, I had opinions about what that should look like." "You had candidates," Clara said. A pause. "Yes," Elaine said. "And I was not what you expected." "No," Elaine said. "You were not." Clara looked at this woman who had spent months making her feel invisible in precisely calibrated increments, and she felt the old exhaustion of it. Not anger, which would have been more energizing, but the tired recognition of a battle fought on uneven ground. "What do you want, Elaine?" she asked, because she was too tired for the long way around. Elaine looked at her. I would like to start again," she said. "If that's possible." Clara considered this. She did not trust it entirely. Elaine Forsythe was too strategic a person for a sudden change of direction to be purely personal. There was likely a calculation involved. Perhaps the harvest supper and Clara's growing presence in it. Perhaps something Gerald Marsh had said that had recalibrated Elaine's assessment of Clara's usefulness. It didn't particularly matter. "I'm not going to forget," Clara said, "but I'm willing to move forward." Elaine nodded. There was something in her expression that was close to relief, and beneath the relief something that might have been, in a person with a different emotional vocabulary, shame. "The harvest supper," Elaine said. "I've been told you've taken it on seriously." "I have," Clara said. "Gerald Forsythe's business has sponsored the main tent for the past 5 years," Elaine said. "If you need anything for the supper, materials, additional supplies, you can come to Gerald." It was an olive branch wrapped in commerce, which was the only kind of olive branch Elaine knew how to extend. Clara recognized the shape of it and accepted it in the spirit it was offered. "Thank you," she said. "I'll let you know if there's something we need." After Elaine left, Clara sat in the front room for a moment. The afternoon light came through the window at a long summer angle, warm and specific, the way late July light was in Wyoming, golden and a little tired, as though the season itself was beginning to understand it couldn't last. She thought about Elaine's apology and what it meant and what it didn't mean. She thought about the harvest supper and the dessert table and Bess Archer's pastry lamination and the cold beef preparation that would save them 2 hours of chaos on the day. She thought about Gerald Marsh's letter in her desk, declined in 2 handwritings, hers and Colton's sent the same day, message. She thought about what Colton had said on the porch, about wanting her to have something of her own, with someone standing behind her who was there because he'd chosen to be. She thought about the harvest supper as the first thing, not the restaurant. Not yet. The supper first, and then she would see what it told her. She got up and went back to the kitchen, because the bread wouldn't shape itself, and Rosa had her own work, and there were things to be done, and Clara Whitlock Hayes was, at her most fundamental level, a person who found her steadiness in the doing of things rather than the thinking about them. She tied on her apron. She got to work. Outside the kitchen window, the long Wyoming summer afternoon was burning slowly toward evening, and the ranch was running, and the house was full of the sounds of people living in it, and none of it was smooth, and none of it was simple, and all of it, she thought, was exactly what she had come here to find. The county fair came on the first weekend of September, when the Wyoming summer had begun its slow retreat, and the mornings carried the first real edge of cold that told you autumn was not a rumor anymore. Clara had been preparing for 6 weeks in the specific way that serious preparation works. Not dramatically, not with visible urgency, but in the accumulated weight of small decisions made correctly and in advance. The cold beef preparation had been tested twice at the ranch, adjusted once for seasoning, and the timing had been written out and given to the 3 women who would be handling it the morning of the fair. The dessert table had been negotiated upward from Adeline's original within reason to something that was, without question, beyond anything the Harwick County Fair had seen before. Not showy, not excessive, but precise and varied and made with the kind of attention that people recognized even when they couldn't articulate why. Bess Archer had been at the ranch every Saturday morning for 6 weeks, and her pastry lamination had improved to the point where Clara had given her the fruit tarts without supervision, which was the most direct form of trust she knew how to offer. Bess received this without making a speech about it, which confirmed Clara's initial assessment that she was someone worth investing time in. Rosa had watched the preparations with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for something like this for a long time and was not going to admit it. On the Thursday before the fair, when Clara was at the kitchen table at midnight going over the supply lists for the 4th time, Rosa came in her robe, poured herself a cup of the cold coffee on the stove, sat down across from her, and said, "You're going to run out of the apple pastries by noon." Clara looked up. "I have 40 dozen. 40 dozen will be gone by noon," Rosa said. "I've been to this fair for 19 years. People lose their minds at the dessert table." Clara looked at her list. "I can't make more before Saturday." "You can if you start tomorrow morning," Rosa said. Clara sat back. She looked at Rosa, this woman who had run Colton's kitchen with the territorial certainty of someone who had earned every inch of it, who had watched Clara reorganize the pantry and accepted it without complaint, who had made room for Bess Archer on Saturday mornings with only minimal suffering. "You'd help me," Clara said. It was not quite a question. "I didn't say that," Rosa said. "I said you could make more if you started tomorrow morning." A pause that lasted exactly long enough. "I also didn't say I wouldn't help." They made 60 additional dozen over the next 2 days. Colton came into the kitchen on Friday evening, looked at the volume of baked goods cooling on every available surface, and left without saying anything. 10 minutes later, he came back with 3 ranch hands who had apparently volunteered, or been volunteered, to help with transport. "You don't have to do this," Clara said. "I know," he said, in the exact same tone she used when she said it. She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen was warm and smelled of apple and cinnamon and the particular yeast smell of bread, and Rosa was at the far end of the room pretending she wasn't watching them, and Colton's expression had the quality she'd come to understand was his version of contentment. Not displayed, not announced, just present. Thank you, she said. Don't, he said. I'm going to anyway, she said. The corner of his mouth. I know, he said. You always do. The fairgrounds on Saturday morning were the particular organized chaos of any large outdoor event. Wagons arriving, tents going up, animals being managed with varying degrees of success, children being managed with less. Clara arrived at 6 in the morning with Rosa, Bess, and 4 women from the committee, and they set up the harvest supper tent in the methodical way of people who had rehearsed this in their heads many times and were now simply executing. Adeline Greer arrived at 7 with her own contingent and walked through the tent with the inspection pace of a general reviewing fortifications. Clara followed at a respectful distance and waited. The beef, Adeline said at the serving station where the cold preparation was arranged. She looked at it. She looked at Clara. Taste it, Clara said. A pause. Adeline took a small portion and tasted it with the careful expression of someone who does not want to be impressed and is finding it difficult to avoid. She set the fork down. It's good, she said, with the tone of a person making a concession. Yes, Clara said, it is. Adeline looked at her. There had been, over the summer, a slow adjustment in the quality of their relationship. Not warmth, not friendship, but a mutual recognition of competence that was its own form of respect. The dessert table, Adeline said. I know, Clara said. It's more than you approved. It is, Adeline said. Do you want me to pull anything? Another pause. Adeline looked at the table. The fruit tarts, the apple pastries, the 3 varieties of pie, the small cookies that had been Bess's contribution and that Clara had tasted the day before, and said nothing about except more of these. She looked at it the way you look at something that has exceeded what you expected without exceeding what you could claim. No, Adeline said. Leave it. And she moved on to the next station, and Clara let out the breath she'd been holding and went back to work. The fair opened at 9. By 11:30, Rosa had been right about the apple pastries. What happened that afternoon was not the dramatic singular event that stories sometimes compress it into. It was a series of smaller things that accumulated into something larger. It was the rancher from the northern part of the county who had driven 40 minutes with his family and who came back to the beef station 3 times, and on the 3rd time asked who had made it. It was the group of women from the Millhaven settlement 20 miles east who had come as a group and who stood at the dessert table for so long that Bess eventually just brought them chairs. It was the merchant from Harwick, who Clara had only ever seen dismiss her with his eyes, and who now stood in front of her and said, with the discomfort of a man making an unexpected correction, Mrs. Hayes, this is extraordinary. It was Harriet Cole finding her at 2 in the afternoon with an expression of contained excitement that Harriet's careful nature kept from becoming theatrical. People are asking where the food is from, Harriet said. Multiple people, specifically. It's from the Harvest Supper Committee, Clara said. They're asking who made it, Harriet said, with the gentle precision of someone who knows the distinction matters and wants to make sure Clara knows she knows. By name. Clara was at the serving station replenishing the bread slices, and she kept doing that, kept her hands on the work. What are they saying? They're saying they've never eaten like this at a county fair, Harriet said. One man, I don't know him, he's from somewhere north of here. He said he's eaten at the hotels in Cheyenne, and this was better. Clara was quiet for a moment. She finished the bread. Tell them the committee worked hard, she said. It was a group effort. Harriet looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had been a doctor's wife long enough to know what people were and were not saying. Clara, she said. Harriet, Clara said. You're doing that thing, Harriet said, where you distribute credit to avoid being seen. Clara looked at her. Harriet was not wrong. It was a habit, old and deep, installed by years of learning that visibility was dangerous, that making yourself the center of something good gave people something to take aim at. She had gotten very efficient at it. It was a group effort, she said again, but she said it less firmly. Harriet made the sound of a woman who is choosing her battles and has decided this one can wait. Adeline's looking for you, she said, near the main tent. Adeline Greer, when Clara found her, was standing with 2 men Clara didn't recognize, both of them in the clothes of men who had money and were comfortable with it, Not the working kind of wealthy, but the invested kind. Mrs. Hayes, Adeline said, and Clara registered the shift. Adeline had called her Clara for the past 2 months, which had been its own small acknowledgement. The return to Mrs. Hayes meant she was being introduced to someone whose opinion Adeline cared about managing. "This is Mr. Franklin Dawes," Adeline said, indicating the older of the two men, a man in his 60s with a careful bearing that Clara associated with people who had spent long careers reading rooms. He operates several commercial ventures in Casper and is in the county for the fair. "Mrs. Hayes," Dawes said, "I've been looking for you since noon." "I've been at the serving stations," Clara said. "I know," he said. "That's where I was told to find you." He looked at her with a directness that was professional rather than personal. "I've been in this county for cattle business 4 times in the past 3 years. I've eaten at every establishment Harwick has. What I've eaten today is different from any of it." Clara recognized this conversation. She had had a version of it with Gerald Marsh 2 months ago, in her front parlor, on a Tuesday when Colton was away. "I appreciate that," she said. "The committee worked. I spoke to 4 different people to find out who was responsible for the food," Dawes said, with the patience of a man who has heard the deflection and is declining to accept it. "They all gave me the same name." He looked at her. "What are you planning to do with this?" Clara looked back at him. She thought about Gerald Marsh and his Tuesday visit and the 2 letters of decline. She thought about what Colton had said about wanting her to have something with her name on it, something built from the ground they were standing on rather than funded from outside it. She thought about the bread she'd learned from her mother and the accounts she'd kept for 8 years and the 11,000 acres of Wyoming she'd been learning one fence post at a time. "I'm still deciding," she said. "If you decide in the direction of a commercial kitchen," Dawes said, "I'd be interested in a conversation." He gave her his card, say, plain, direct, a name and an address in Casper. Not a proposal, just a conversation. She took the card. She did not commit to anything. He seemed to understand this was not evasion, but precision, and he nodded and moved on. Adeline looked at her after he left with an expression that had something in it Clara hadn't seen before, something adjacent to wonder, which sat uneasily on Adeline's features, as though her face didn't have a natural configuration for it. "That's the second investor in 2 months," Adeline said. "Yes," Clara said. "You turned down the first one." "Yes," Clara said. "Are you going to turn down Dawes?" Clara pocketed the card. "I don't know yet," she said. "Right now I need to check on the beef station." Colton found her at 4 in the afternoon when the fair was beginning its long wind down, and the quality of the light had shifted into the amber register of a September afternoon, going gold at the edges. He had been present all day at the periphery, helping with wagon logistics in the morning, visible at the cattle and horse competitions in the afternoon, not in the food tent where Clara was working, but not far from it. He found her at the edge of the tent, sitting on an upturned crate with her shoes off, which was a concession to physical reality that she had resisted until roughly 3:30 and then made without apology. She was eating a piece of bread from the supply they hadn't served yet, which was another concession. She had not stopped to eat all day. He sat down on the ground next to the crate. This was a thing she had observed about him. He did not look for a chair when the ground was available and he was tired, which was a working man's habit that had survived his wealth without being affected by it. "How bad are your feet?" he said. "Bad enough," she said. "How were the horses?" "Good. Silas Drum's nephew showed a colt that beat everything in the county." "Did you tell Silas?" "I wrote to him," he said. "He'll appreciate knowing." She ate the bread. He sat with his arms on his knees and looked at the fairground. The families packing up, the children who had been running all day now limp with exhaustion, the particular gorgeous mess of a large outdoor event at its close. "People were asking about you all afternoon," he said. "I heard," she said. "Dawes spoke to me too," he said. "After he spoke to you, I think." She looked at him. "What did he say to you?" "He asked how serious you were," Colton said, "about building something." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to ask you," Colton said, "that you were the one to answer that question, not me." He looked at her sideways. "Did he ask you?" "He gave me his card," she said, "and said he'd be interested in a conversation." "And?" She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the fair was breathing out its last hours, and the sky over the Wyoming hills was the particular color of September at 5 o'clock, something between gold and blue that had no good name for it. I want to talk to you about something, she said. All right. Not here, she said. Tonight. At home. He looked at her with the steady attention that was his most reliable quality. Is it bad? No, she said. It's just something I need to say out loud before I can know if it's true. Chat. They drove home with the wagon loaded with the equipment from the tent, Rosa dozing in the back against a folded tablecloth, and Bess Archer wedged in beside her, having fallen asleep entirely with her mouth open. Clara sat beside Colton on the bench, and they drove into the evening without talking much, and the silence was the comfortable kind. After the wagon was unloaded and Rosa and Bess were inside, and the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse, Colton and Clara sat on the porch in the dark. The fireflies were gone now. It was September, past their season, and the stars were hard and bright in the way they got once the summer warmth left the air. The restaurant, Clara said. I've been thinking about it since Marsh came in July. I know, he said. You've been thinking about it since before that. She looked at him. Since before that, she agreed. I just didn't have the language for it yet. What's the language now? She pulled her coat tighter against the night air. I want to build something here, she said. Not in Casper, not funded from the outside. Here, in Harwick, with what we already have. She paused. I want to build it the way the ranch was built. Slowly, from the foundation out, so that if it lasts, it's because it's actually standing on something. What would it need? He said. The question was practical, not skeptical. The question of a man who is already calculating rather than still deciding whether to commit. Space, she said, not the house. Something separate. A proper kitchen attached to a dining room that could seat 30 people, maybe 40. A location in Harwick, not out here. People need to be able to get to it. She turned to look at him. It would take time to become what it could be. 2 years minimum before it was paying for itself. Maybe more. He was quiet. That's what you want, he said. Not a question. That's what I want, she said. The question is whether it makes sense and whether... She stopped. Whether what? He said. She looked at him. She had been careful, through everything, not to conflate what was hers and what was his. She had kept the accounts and managed the household and cooked in the kitchen and built something in the county that was beginning to have her name on it, and she had done all of it with the independence that was the only way she knew how to live. Colton had understood this without her having to explain it, which was one of the qualities she valued most in him. But there was a version of this conversation where she was asking him for something, and she needed to be honest about that. This would require your land in Harwick, she said, the lot you own on the east side of Main Street. I know you've been thinking about a feed supply building there. He looked at her. You know about that? I keep your accounts, she said. The purchase is in there from 3 years ago. You've paid the taxes on it every year. I have, he said. I haven't done anything with it because I couldn't decide what it needed to be. He was quiet for a moment. What would you need to build on it? A kitchen and dining space, she said. Construction, equipment, the first year's operating costs. She named the figure she'd calculated, which was specific and conservative because she had been doing her math honestly. It's a significant amount. It's not an unreasonable amount, he said. It's still your money, she said, and your land. I want to be clear about what I'm asking and what I'm not asking. He looked at the dark yard, the barn, the shapes of the horses moving somewhere in the paddock. He looked at them for a long time with the expression of a man who has thought carefully about something already and is now just finding the right words for a conclusion he's reached. You're not asking me to fund your restaurant, he said. You're asking me to be your partner. She looked at him. Yes, she said. That's exactly what I'm asking. Those are different things, he said. I know they are, she said. One of them means you get a return on the investment and I'm working for myself. The other means we're both building something and it belongs to both of us and we both take the risk. Partners, he said. If you want to be, she said. If you don't, I'll find another way. I'll talk to Dawes or I'll save over 2 years and do it smaller to start. I'm not dependent on this. She paused. But I want it to be this way if you're willing. He was quiet for a long moment. The stars moved imperceptibly overhead in the way they did. the whole sky turning so slowly that you only noticed if you looked away and looked back. You should know something, he said. All right. I've never... He stopped. Started again. When Margaret and I ran this ranch, it was always mine. She worked it as much as I did, understood it as much as I did, and it was still always mine because the law said so, and because I'd inherited it, and because that's how things are. He looked at his hands. I didn't think about it then. I think about it now. Clara looked at him. She understood what he was saying, and she understood the difficulty with which he was saying it. This man who had inherited 11,000 acres and held them without questioning the nature of holding. What I'm proposing, she said carefully, would be mine as much as yours from the beginning. In writing, not just in intention. I know, he said. That's what I'm saying. I want it that way. The night was very still around them. Clara felt something in her chest that was close to the feeling she'd had on the platform at Harwick Station when he hadn't given her the look she'd expected. The specific shock of finding something you'd stopped looking for. All right, she said. Then we'll do it that way. All right, he said. They sat on the porch for a while longer in the dark, and the conversation moved into easier territory. The practicalities, the timeline, the conversation they'd need to have with the Harwick surveyor about the East Lot's dimensions. These were comfortable subjects. They were both better with practicalities than with the other kind. But before they went in, Colton said with the sideways approach to important things that she'd come to know was just how he was. I want to say something, and I want you to let me finish before you say anything. All right, she said. I wrote to that agency because I was tired, he said. That's the truth of it. I was tired of the house being quiet, and I thought I needed someone to fill it in a practical way, someone who could manage things. He paused. I didn't think I was going to find someone Another pause. Someone whose company I could not imagine doing without. Clara sat very still. I don't say things like this well, he said. I know that. But I didn't want to build the restaurant and the partnership and all of it without saying it at least once. This isn't transactional for me anymore. If it ever was. Clara looked at him in the dark. This large, difficult, deliberate man who had stood on a platform in winter and not flinched. Who had sat in a kitchen and listened, who had written the declining letter on the same day she wrote hers because he wanted her to have backup she hadn't asked for, who was sitting on his own porch in September telling her something it had cost him to say. Colton, she said, you don't have to, he started. I'm not, she said. I was going to say, I know it's not transactional for you. It stopped being transactional for me sometime around March, and I haven't known how to say it either. She looked at the stars. I'm better at this than you are, and I still couldn't find the words. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted all at once, like a thing that had been held in tension for a long time releasing. We're two very bad communicators, he said. We're adequate, she said. We got there eventually. Eventually, he agreed. Well, the week after the fair moved through the ranch with the particular texture of aftermath. The physical tiredness from the fair itself, the animals needing attention after a weekend of reduced management, the accounts to be reconciled and the equipment to be returned, and the thank you note Clara wrote to Adeline Greer that was specific and genuine and which Adeline, according to Harriet Cole, read 3 times. Dawes sent a letter from Casper. Clara wrote back, thanked him for his interest, and told him she was pursuing another direction. She was brief and direct, and she signed it Clara Hayes without hesitation. Elaine Forsythe appeared on Wednesday with her husband Gerald, who turned out to be, in person, significantly more perceptive than the mild background figure she'd formed from brief encounters. He sat in Colton's office with the two of them and discussed the East Lot and the building project with the practical attention of a man who knew construction and procurement, and he offered to connect them with a builder from Cheyenne who had done good work on 3 commercial properties in the county. Clara looked at Colton. Colton looked at Clara. We'd appreciate that, Clara said. After Gerald and Elaine left, Colton said, she told him to offer. I know, Clara said. It's the only currency she has for apology. She paused. But the builder recommendation is genuine. Gerald doesn't do things just because Elaine says to. How do you know that? He looked at the plans before he offered, she said. He wasn't just being polite. Colton looked at her with the expression he sometimes had when she'd seen something before he had. which was a look that managed to be both slightly startled and not at all resentful, which was rarer than she'd expected in a man of his position. "You pay attention to everything," he said. "I always have," she said. "It used to be a survival skill. Now it's just habit." He was quiet for a moment. "It's more than habit," he said. "It's—" He stopped, looked for the word. "It's the thing that makes you good at this." "At what?" she said. "At all of it," he said. "The accounting, the cooking, the Adelines, and the Elaines of the world. You see what's actually happening." Clara considered this. It was not flattery. Colton Hayes did not produce flattery. It was an observation delivered in the same tone as the east fence needs a new post at the third marker, or Rosa's right about the apple pastries, which meant it was what he actually thought. "I've had to," she said. "When you can't rely on the obvious advantages, you learn to rely on the less obvious ones." "Is that a complaint?" he asked. She thought about it. "No," she said. "It used to feel like one. Now it just feels like who I am." He nodded. Outside the office window, the September afternoon was doing what September afternoons did in Wyoming, burning clean and bright and already carrying the ghost of the cold that was coming. The ranch was running. The accounts were in order. On the east side of Main Street in Harwick, there was a lot that had been sitting fallow for 3 years, waiting to be something, and now it knew what it was going to be. Clara picked up her pen. She had letters to write. To the builder Gerald Forsythe was connecting them with. To Lucinda Whitfield, who had been the first person to take her cooking seriously in this county and who deserved to know what was coming. To Bess Archer, who was going to be offered a real position if she wanted it. She had a list of things to do that was long and specific, and she was aware that the list would keep growing and that the work ahead was harder than anything she'd done so far. She was aware of something else too, sitting in the office of the Hayes Ranch on a September afternoon with the sun coming through the window and Colton at his own desk 8 feet away, going through the cattle records with the focused quietness of a man doing the work he'd been doing all his life. She was not invisible here. She was not the plain woman from Iowa who had been managed and apologized about and written out of rooms. She was Clara Hayes, who had reorganized the pantry and corrected the accounts and made peace with Rosa and turned down 2 investors and organized a harvest supper that people were still talking about, and who was going to build something on the east side of Main Street that had her name on it from the foundation up. She started writing. The builder Gerald Forsythe connected them with was a man named Otto Kress, who arrived from Cheyenne in early October with a measuring tape, a notebook, and the deeply skeptical expression of a craftsman who has learned that clients always want more than they've budgeted for and arrive at that understanding only after the foundation has been poured. He walked the east lot on Main Street with Colton and Clara on a cold Tuesday morning, and he asked questions that were precise and unsentimental. Load-bearing requirements for a commercial kitchen, ventilation, the water supply situation on that side of the street, whether the dining room needed to accommodate foot traffic from outside or was a seated-only establishment. Clara answered most of them. Colton answered the ones about the lot's structural history. Otto wrote everything down without comment. At the end of the walkthrough, Otto looked at his notebook and then at Clara. "You've thought about this," he said. "For a while," she said. "The kitchen placement is right," he said. "Most people put the kitchen at the back as an afterthought. You've got it oriented to the alley for delivery access, and the ventilation can run north." "That's correct." He made a sound that was not quite approval, but was in its neighborhood. "I can build this." "What's your timeline?" Colton asked. "If we start before the hard freeze, I can get the foundation and the frame up this fall and close it in before December. Interior work through winter, open in the spring." He named his price, which was honest and not cheap. Colton looked at Clara. Clara looked at the lot. "All right," she said. They shook hands on it. Walking back to the wagon, Colton said, "Spring." "I know," Clara said. "It's a long winter to wait." "You're not good at waiting," he said. She looked at him. "I'm excellent at waiting," she said. "I just prefer not to." He almost smiled. "What are you going to do with the winter?" "Refine the menu," she said. "Test everything. Train Bess properly. Figure out the supply relationships." She paused. "And keep your accounts, which are still not as precise as they could be." "My accounts are fine," he said. "Your accounts are functional," she said. "There's a difference." He made the sound that was his version of conceding a point without saying the words. Timney. The winter was not easy, and Clara had not expected it to be. The cold came hard in November and stayed, the kind of Wyoming winter that was less dramatic than brutal. Not blizzards every week, but a persistent, grinding cold that made every outdoor task take twice as long and drained the energy from people and animals alike. Colton was out in it constantly, managing the herd through the cold with the dogged practicality of a man who had done this enough times to have no illusions about it. He came in late most evenings and ate whatever was on the stove without complaint, and went to bed and got up before dawn and did it again. Clara watched this and thought about what she'd said on the porch in September, that she couldn't imagine doing without his company. She thought about it because the winter showed her a different version of it than the summer had. The summer had been the version where there was time for porch conversations and evening quietness and the slow accumulation of closeness. The winter was the version where he was exhausted and she was occupied, and they existed in the same house with the practical efficiency of two people who had each other's rhythms memorized. It was not romantic. It was better than romantic. It was the ordinary daily texture of a life built with someone, which Clara had not known she was missing because she had never had it to miss. She learned his signals, the particular set of his shoulders when the cold had gone into his hands in a way that would make him clumsy by evening. She learned to have water heating before he came in, the way he ate less when something was worrying him. She learned to read the plate and adjust accordingly, making things that were easier to eat without thinking about it. He learned hers too, though he learned them silently, and she discovered them only by noticing that things had been accommodated before she'd asked. The oil lamp moved to the better angle on the night she was doing close accounts work. The firewood stacked closer to the kitchen door on the mornings when the cold was worst. They were not demonstrative people. They were not people who spoke frequently about what they felt. But they had built, over the course of a year, a language out of exactly those kinds of small adjustments, and it was more specific and more reliable than words. One evening in December, coming in from a particularly brutal day, Colton sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands in a gesture of exhaustion so complete and unguarded that Clara stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "How bad?" she said. "Lost 2 calves," he said into his hands. Cold got into the east shelter through a gap we missed. By the time we found them, he stopped. She came around the table and put her hand on his shoulder. She didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to say about 2 dead calves in winter, except that it happened, and it was a loss, and it was part of this life. She kept her hand there for a moment, solid, present, and then she went and got him food and sat across from him while he ate it. "The shelter's fixed," he said, when he'd eaten half of it. "I know," she said. "You'd have done it before you came in." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "How did you know that?" "Because that's how you are," she said. "You fix the thing before you stop." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not always a good quality," he said. "No," she said, "but it's yours." He finished eating. The kitchen was warm, and the wind was doing what Wyoming wind did in December, pushing against every wall as though it had a personal grievance. Clara poured them both coffee, and they sat with it, and neither of them talked much, and it was enough. In January, a letter arrived from the matrimonial agency. It was addressed to Colton, which was unusual, and he brought it to Clara without opening it, which told her something about how the year had changed the nature of things between them. "It'll be for you as much as me," he said. She opened it. The agency wrote that a woman named Ruth Calloway, 31 years of age, had inquired about the Hayes Ranch specifically. She had apparently spoken to someone who knew Colton, or knew of him, and had heard that he'd married through correspondence, and that the arrangement had, the agency's phrasing was careful, proved satisfactory. Ruth Calloway was looking for a placement in Wyoming. She had included a brief letter of her own at the agency's suggestion. Clara read Ruth's letter. It was not like her own first letter. It was less composed, more frightened. The letter of a woman who had not yet learned to keep her fear in the margins. Ruth had been in a difficult situation in her home state of Missouri. She described it obliquely, the way people describe things they are ashamed of that were not their fault. And she needed to leave. She was not asking for charity. She was asking for a fair chance. And then, in the last line, in handwriting that had pressed harder into the page than the rest, as though the pen had needed the extra pressure to get the words out, "I am not beautiful. I know this may matter. I'm telling you now so that it cannot be used against me later. Clara set the letter down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment. Colton watched her. "What is it?" he said. She pushed the letter across the table to him. He read it. His face did the thing it sometimes did with things that mattered to him. Went very still, the way deep water is still rather than the way empty things are. "She's scared," he said. "She's practical," Claire said. "She's scared and she's being practical about it, which is not the same as just being scared." He looked at her. "You recognize it," he said. "I wrote a version of that letter," Claire said. "I know exactly what it costs." They sat with it for a moment. Outside, January was pressing its full weight against the windows. "We can't take in everyone who writes to the agency," Colton said, which was true and was not a refusal. It was him thinking out loud, identifying the edges of the problem. "No," Clara said, "but we can write back." "What would we say?" Clara thought about it. She thought about the platform in January, a year ago, and the moment she'd been waiting for that hadn't come. She thought about what it had meant to have that moment not come. The specific, staggering relief of it, the way it had changed the shape of everything that followed. "We'd say that we don't have a placement for her here," she said, "but that I know what it is to arrive somewhere new with nothing but a letter and a willingness to work, and that the restaurant is going to need staff in the spring, and that if she wants to write to me directly, I'll write back." Colton looked at her. He had an expression she'd seen a few times in the years she'd known him. Something that wasn't quite what she'd have called love in the sentimental sense, but was in the same country. Something that saw her clearly and was not diminished by the seeing. "Write it," he said. She did. The restaurant opened on the 14th of April. It was not a grand opening in the sense of ceremony. Clara was not a person given to ceremony, and Colton was even less so. There was no ribbon cutting, no formal announcement. The sign went up on a Wednesday. Hayes Kitchen, established 1886, in clean painted letters on a dark board visible from the main street. And on Thursday morning, Clara unlocked the door at 7 o'clock, and Bess Archer was already standing on the step with her coat on and a look of barely contained impatience. "You're early," Clara said. "I've been here since 6:30, Bess said. "I was cold." "Come in then," Clara said. The kitchen was everything Otto Kress had built it to be. Functional, correctly oriented, the ventilation running true, the prep surfaces at the right height and in the right sequence for the way a commercial kitchen needed to move. Clara had spent February and March in it doing test runs, adjusting, learning its particular temperament the way you learn any new workspace, and she had the menu refined to the point where she could execute it without uncertainty, which was the only condition under which she was willing to open. The menu was not ambitious in the way that drew attention to itself. It was ambitious in the way of someone who understood that doing a limited number of things consistently well was worth more than doing many things variably. Breakfast until 10, a midday meal until 2, and on Fridays a supper service that was the thing she was most particular about and most proud of. The first morning was slow. 4 customers before 9 o'clock, 2 of whom were Harriet Cole and Lucinda Whitfield, who had clearly coordinated their arrival in the way of women who understood that the first days of a new enterprise needed witnesses. "You're here to support me," Clara said when they sat down. "We're here because we're hungry," Harriet said, with the innocent expression of someone lying badly on purpose. "Order what you want," Clara said. "Don't tell me it's wonderful unless it is." "When has anything I said to you not been true?" Harriet said. "You told me Adeline would come around easily," Clara said. "I said she might come around," Harriet said. "I was right. I didn't specify the timeline." Clara left them with their coffee and went back to the kitchen, where Bess was at the stove with the particular focused expression she'd developed over winter. The expression of someone who had found the thing they were good at and was no longer apologizing for wanting to be good at it. By noon, the dining room was full. Not dramatically, not all at once. People came in ones and twos the way people approach unfamiliar things, cautiously, wanting to see what it was before committing. But they came. The rancher from the North County, who had come back to the beef station 3 times at the fair, came in at 11:30 and ate a full midday meal and left a generous amount on the table. 3 of the ranch hands from a neighboring spread came in together and ate with the focused appreciation of working men who knew what they were tasting. Gerald Forsythe came in alone, without Elaine, and ate quietly in the corner, and on his way out told Clara that the bread was the best he'd had west of Chicago, which was specific enough to be credible. Adeline Greer came at 1:40 when the midday rush had thinned. She sat at a table by the window and ordered without asking questions about the menu, which meant she'd already read it carefully, and she ate with the careful attention of someone conducting an evaluation. When she finished, she sat for a moment with her coffee. Clara came out from the kitchen and sat across from her because she had learned, in dealing with Adeline, that the direct approach was more effective than waiting. "Well?" she said. Adeline looked at her. "The soup," she said. "Yes?" "What's in the stock?" "I'm not going to tell you that," Clara said. The corner of Adeline's mouth moved, a thing Clara had never seen it do before. "No," Adeline said. "I didn't think you would." She looked around the room, the clean lines of it, the tables that were correctly spaced, the window that faced Main Street and let in the afternoon light at the angle Clara had specifically asked Otto to account for. "You built this well," she said. "We built it well," Clara said. "The committee's supper gave me the reputation to try. That matters." Adeline looked at her with the appraising eyes of a woman who has been distributing and withholding credit for a long time and knows when it's being offered fairly. "Don't overstate my contribution," she said. "I made your life difficult." "You did," Clara agreed. "And then you let me prove myself anyway. Those aren't mutually exclusive things." Adeline was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Friday supper service. I'd like a standing reservation." "You have one," Clara said. Colton came in at 2 o'clock, after the midday service had wound down and Bess was cleaning the kitchen. He stood in the doorway of the dining room in his work coat, hat in hand, and looked at the room with the expression of a man taking stock of something he has a stake in. Clara was at the corner table going over the morning's accounts. She looked up when he came in. "How was it?" he said. "Full at noon," she said. "Slow in the morning. Adeline came at the end." "How was Adeline?" "She wants a standing reservation on Fridays." He came and sat across from her. He looked at the account book, then at the room, then at her. "You're not going to tell me how you feel about today," he said. "I'm trying to decide," she said. "Decide out loud," he said. She looked at the dining room, this space she had described in a letter to Otto Kress in October and watched become real through November and December and January, this room that smelled of the morning's bread and had the afternoon light coming through the window at exactly the angle she'd intended. She thought about what it had taken to get here. Not the year of letters and arriving and the cold platform and Elaine Forsythe and Adeline Greer and the harvest supper. She meant the longer before that. The 11 years in her father's house, the Thomas Hale years, the 3 years after, the particular grinding endurance of staying intact when a place has decided what you are and has no interest in revising its decision. "I feel like I built something," she said, "not had something built for me, not been given something, built something." "You did," he said. "We did," she said. "Don't let me revise you out of it." "I supplied the lot and the capital," he said. "Yes, you supplied everything else." "You supplied more than that," she said. And she meant the platform and the winter evenings and the letter written the same day as hers and the hand on the shoulder in December and the way he had learned her signals without being asked. "You supplied the part that made the rest possible." He looked at the table, the way he did when things went past his comfort with sentiment. "That's generous," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "There's a difference." He looked up at her with the expression she knew best, the steady one, the one that had been there on the platform in January and had not wavered in the year since, the one that saw her precisely and was not made uncomfortable by what it saw. "It's a good room," he said. "It is," she said. "Come back Friday. I'll feed you the supper menu." "I own the place," he said. "I can eat here any time." "Friday," she said, "when it's properly running. I want you to see it when it's what it's supposed to be." Ruth Calloway arrived in Harwick on the 1st of May. She had written back to Clara in February, and they had exchanged 4 letters before Ruth decided to come. In those letters, Clara had not offered her anything except honesty. What the work would be, what it would pay, what Harwick was and wasn't, what the restaurant was in its earliest days, and what it might become. She had not offered the kind of reassurances that feel good to give and cost the recipient later. She had told the truth and said, "If this sounds like something you can work with, come. If not, No shame in it. Ruth came. She was a small woman, younger than she'd seemed in her letters, with a wariness in her eyes that Clara recognized the way you recognize a landscape you've lived in. She stepped off the train at Harwich Station with a bag that was too heavy for her, and the particular stillness of a person waiting for the first blow to land so they can calibrate the rest accordingly. Clara was on the platform. She had come alone, not because Colton wouldn't have come, but because she thought it mattered for Ruth to be met by another woman first, before the weight of a new situation settled fully. She'd thought about this. She'd thought about what she'd needed on this platform 14 months ago and what she'd gotten. And she'd decided that what she could give Ruth was something close to that. She walked toward Ruth and did not look at her face in the assessing way. She looked at the bag. "That's too heavy," Clara said. "Let me take it." Ruth looked at her. "Mrs. Hayes?" "Clara," she said. "Take the smaller one." Ruth relinquished the bag with the expression of someone who expected conditions to be attached and couldn't yet locate them. "Thank you for writing back," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I said I would," Clara said. "I do what I say." She picked up the bag and turned toward the wagon, and Ruth fell into step beside her, and they walked the length of the platform in the spring afternoon light, which was the pale, clean light of early May when the country was just beginning to believe in warmth again. "Is it how you expected?" Ruth asked, looking at the town, the flat land, the wide sky. "No," Clara said. "It was bigger than I expected, the sky especially." "Does it get better? The bigness?" Clara thought about what Colton had said on the drive from this station 14 months ago. "It gets bigger. You get used to the size eventually, and then later on the porch, mostly it makes other things feel less important." "It doesn't get smaller," Clara said. "You just get better at standing in it." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, with the directness of someone who has decided that the long way around costs more than the short way through, "I told you in my letter that I wasn't beautiful." "I remember," Clara said. "I wanted to say it in person too," Ruth said, "so there's no room for later confusion." Clara stopped at the wagon and turned to look at her. She looked at this young woman who had pressed harder into the page to write those words, who had come to Wyoming on the strength of 4 letters and a willingness to try, who was standing in the May light with her jaw set in the particular way of people who have learned to brace. "I know what it is," Clara said, "to say that to someone and wait for what comes next." Ruth looked at her, waiting. "What comes next," Clara said, it doesn't matter here. Not in the way you're afraid it does." She paused. "That doesn't mean it's never hard. It means it's not the thing that decides your value. Those are different." She picked up the bag again. "Now get in the wagon. I'll show you the restaurant and then we'll go out to the ranch for supper. Colton makes terrible coffee, but the ranch is beautiful." Ruth got in the wagon with the expression of someone who had been braced for something and found the bracing wasn't needed and didn't quite know what to do with her hands now. The restaurant in its first full season was not a triumph in the clean sense. It was a success in the way that real things succeed, imperfectly, gradually, with setbacks that had to be absorbed and adjusted for and learned from. The Friday supper service oversold in May, and Clara had to turn people away, which she hated, and she adjusted the reservation system accordingly. The midday service was inconsistent through June as the summer cattle work pulled people away from town and then brought them back in waves, and she had to learn the rhythm of the county's working life and set her menu to it rather than expecting the county to adapt to her. One of the suppliers she'd contracted with for quality beef failed to deliver twice in 3 weeks. She dropped him and found another, which cost her 2 weeks of menu adjustment and a kind of controlled anger that she channeled into the account books rather than at anyone who didn't deserve it. Ruth turned out to be exactly who her letters had suggested: steady, quick to learn, and possessed of a competence in the dining room that Clara hadn't specifically looked for and was very glad to have found. She moved between tables with the efficient grace of someone who has spent years reading rooms, and she had a memory for names and preferences that meant regular customers felt known from the 3rd visit onward, which was worth more than any advertisement. Bess Archer had her first real professional success in July, when a cattle buyer from Denver ate 3 of her fruit tarts in one sitting and asked to speak to the pastry cook. Bess came out of the kitchen in her flour-dusted apron and received the man's effusive compliments with the same expression she'd used on the Thursday committee meetings. Direct, slightly impatient, not pretending to be more overwhelmed than she was. He asked if she had plans to stay in Harwich. She said yes. He said it was a waste. She said she didn't think so. Clara, watching from the kitchen doorway, felt the specific warmth of seeing a young woman handle a room correctly. There were days that were genuinely hard. A week in August when Clara was sick, not badly, but enough to take her out of the kitchen for 3 days, and she had to run the restaurant through written instructions delivered by Colton, who ferried notes between the ranch and the town with the patient reliability of a man who did not complain about tasks he'd agreed to. When she came back, the kitchen was slightly out of order in ways that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't organized it, and she put it back to rights without comment and felt, in doing so, the slightly humbling recognition that things she'd built were not yet stable enough to run entirely without her, which meant there was still more to build. She was not discouraged by this. She was informed by it. On a Saturday afternoon in late September, exactly 1 year from the county fair near enough, Clara stood behind the counter of Hayes' Kitchen and watched Harwick move past the window on Main Street. The restaurant was between services. Bess had gone home, Ruth was in the back doing inventory, and the kitchen was clean and the dining room was quiet, with the satisfied quiet of a place that had fed people well and would do so again tomorrow. Colton came in at 3:30. He still came in work clothes when he came directly from the ranch, which she had given up hoping would change. He came to the counter, and she put coffee in front of him without asking, and he wrapped his hands around it and looked at the room. "Adeline was in this morning," Clara said. "On a Saturday?" "She said she was in town for other reasons," Clara said. "She came in for the soup." "What's in the soup?" he said. "She's been trying to get that out of Rosa for a month." "Rosa doesn't know either," Clara said. "I keep the stock base separately." "That's deliberate," he said. "Of course it's deliberate," she said. "Some things are worth protecting." He drank his coffee. She leaned on the counter and looked out the window with him at the September afternoon on Main Street, a wagon going past, 2 men in conversation outside the hardware store, a child running after a dog with the total commitment of someone who has no other concern in the world. "Ruth is staying through winter," Clara said. "She told me yesterday." "Good," he said. "She's good for the room." "She's good at everything," Clara said. "She's better at the dining room than I am, actually. I'm better in the kitchen." "You're precise about that," he said, "about knowing what you're good at." "I spent a lot of years being imprecise about it in the other direction," she said, "assuming I was less than I was. I'm correcting for that now." He looked at her. The afternoon light came through the window at the long September angle and caught the edge of things. The counter, the coffee cup, the side of his face. He was a man who had gone gray at the temples in the year she'd known him, which she hadn't noticed happening, and then one day noticed had happened. He was still the same man from the platform in winter, solid and hard to know and worth knowing. But he had changed too, in the small ways that proximity and trust and time change people. He laughed more than he had. Not often, not openly, but more. He talked more. He had told her 3 things about his father in the past year that he'd never told anyone, she suspected, because they were the kind of things that you only tell someone you've stopped being careful around. "I want to tell you something," she said. "I've been trying to find the right way to say it for a while." "Just say it," he said. "You're usually better at this than you think." She looked at the street. She looked at the room she had built, the room that was hers in the document at the county surveyor's office, and in the daily reality of unlocking the door and starting the fire and beginning again. She thought about what she'd carried from Cedar Falls and what she'd put down in Wyoming, and she thought about the difference between surviving and living, which was the kind of thing she'd understood intellectually for years and had only begun to understand in her body in the past 12 months. "I used to think that what had happened to me in Cedar Falls was the defining story," she said, "the Thomas Hale story. The being seen as less than story. I thought it had made me smaller than I actually was, and I thought, even after I came here, even when things started to go well, I kept waiting for it to catch up, for someone to find the real story, the Cedar Falls version, and use it to revise what I'd built here." "And?" he said. "And it didn't," she said. "Or it tried, and it didn't work. And I've been sitting with the question of why, and I think—" She paused. "I think it's because I stopped waiting for permission to be worth something. I stopped waiting for someone to decide I was enough and just acted like I already was. Not loudly, not dramatically, just made the next decision and then the next one." He was quiet, listening, in the way he listened to things that mattered, with his whole attention. I'm saying this because Ruth came here the way I came here, Clara said, waiting for the assessment, waiting for the moment when someone confirmed her fear. And I can see her starting to do what I did, which is to stop waiting and start acting. And it made me realize that it's not something a person teaches another person. You can't hand it to them. She looked at him. But you can show them what it looks like when someone lives that way. And that's the thing I can give her that actually matters. Colton set down his coffee cup. He looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at her, and his expression was the one she'd learned over the course of a year was his most honest one. Not the measured face he showed the ranch hands and the county ranchers and the Adeline Greers of the world, but the face he had when there was no performance required. "You know what I think," he said. "Tell me anyway," she said. "You're better at it than you think." "I think you've been worth something this entire time," he said. Cedar Falls didn't change that. Thomas Hale didn't change that. The only thing that changed is that you stopped letting other people's arithmetic decide what the number is. She looked at him. "That's well put," she said. "I had time to think about it," he said. "You gave me plenty of examples to work from." The afternoon light moved across the floor of Hayes' kitchen. Outside, Harwick was doing what it did on a Saturday, conducting the ordinary business of a small frontier town that was alive and imperfect and real, full of people making their calculations and their mistakes and their adjustments. On the east side of Main Street, a restaurant with a dark painted sign was doing the quiet work of being exactly what it was supposed to be. The rest of it, the rest of their life, the ranch, and the kitchen, and the accounts, and the long Wyoming winters, and the springs that came eventually and changed everything again, was not the kind of story that had a clean ending, because those were not the kinds of lives that had clean endings. They had Tuesday mornings and aching feet and arguments about the coffee and the slow accumulation of days that meant something, not because they were exceptional, but because they were lived fully, by two people who had each found, in the other, someone worth being honest with. That was enough. That was in fact more than enough. It was the whole of it.